To be a space marine of the Adeptus Astartes is to be a living paradox. We forge them in the fires of genetic alchemy to be the ultimate shield of humanity, the transhuman bulwark against the terror of the void. Yet the Imperium they bleed for is conditioned to fear the very strength that preserves it. We demand monsters to fight our wars, but we tremble when those monsters cast shadows upon our golden thrones. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, a warrior can cleave through a tide of Xeno's monstrosities and emerge unblemished, only to be butchered by the quiet, creeping paranoia of his own masters. Surviving the horrors of the galaxy is a matter of martial prowess. Surviving the suffocating suspicion of the Imperium is something else entirely. High above the jewel of Ultramar, Demetrian Titus stands alone. He looks out over the colossal orbital plates of Macragge, watching the void ships cycle through the dockyards of his home world. He does not stand here as a glorious champion bathed in the light of absolute victory. He is a tragic figure, a soul bearing the unseen scars of a century of betrayal and exile. His life was stolen from him by the very institutions he swore to uphold, cast into the dark for the crime of being too effective, and now that life has been returned, cold and hollow. The armor he wears is familiar, yet the flesh beneath it remembers the chains of the Inquisition. Titus embodies the tragedy of the loyal son who loves an empire that cannot love him back. To understand his fall, one must first understand the chains that bind the minds of his brothers. The Codex Astartes is not merely a manual of war. It is a sacred, immutable scripture laid down by the Primarch Guilliman 10,000 years ago. For the Ultramarines, it dictates every facet of existence, from orbital deployment to the firing patterns of a single squad. It is a rigid, dogmatic architecture of obedience. In the suffocating orthodoxy of the modern Imperium, deviation from these holy pages is not viewed as tactical flexibility. It is viewed as a moral failing. Independent thought is the fertile soil in which the seeds of heresy take root. To step beyond the margins of the Codex is to invite the gaze of those who see treason in every shadow. Titus dared to look beyond those margins. He understood that the galaxy does not conform to ancient texts, and that to fight the true horrors of the Immaterium, a warrior must adapt or perish. This pragmatic wisdom was his greatest weapon, and it became his ultimate undoing. The tragedy of Demetrian Titus was not forged on the battlefields of a doomed Forge world, but in the whispered accusations of those who shared his colors. His fate was sealed the moment he prioritized the survival of humanity over the blind recitation of dogma. The fires of Forge World Graia illuminated this tragic paranoia in the most bitter of colors. Graia was a realm consumed by madness. A brutal orc invasion had fractured the planet, only to be eclipsed by a far darker shadow. The sorcerer Nemeroth unleashed the forces of chaos, tearing open the veil of the Immaterium to drown the world in demonic fury. Yet history does not remember Graia for the millions who died in its defense. It remembers Graia for the impossible resilience of Captain Titus of the Ultramarines. Titus fought through the greenskin tide and the horrors of the warp with a strength that defied mortal understanding. The true turning point was not born of bolter or blade. It occurred at the apex of the nightmare when the experimental power source threatened to tear the planet apart. Unleashing pure warp energy, the device annihilated everything it touched. Any loyal servant of the Emperor should have been unmade in an instant, their soul flayed by the raw stuff of chaos. Titus did not burn. He reached into the searing maelstrom of the unholy machine. He grasped the conduit of the power source with his bare hands. The malignant energies washed over his armor, yet his flesh held firm. His spirit remained unbroken. He shattered the device and banished the dark ritual, surviving what should have been absolute obliteration. To the average citizen, this would be a miracle. To Leandros, a young space marine chained to the absolute dogma of the Codex Astartes, it was a profound terror. The Codex teaches that none are immune to the touch of the archenemy. To Leandros, a rigid adherent to the holy text, the logic was inescapable and terrifying. If a man can touch the raw warp and not burn, he is not resisting the corruption. He is already a part of it. Leandros could not comprehend a strength born of pure, incorruptible will. He saw only heresy masquerading as salvation. Bound by his dogmatic fear, Leandros betrayed his own commander. The victory on Graia turned to ash as the true cost of Titus's defiance arrived from the heavens. The smog-choked sky above the Forge world parted, giving way to the imposing silhouettes of Inquisition black ships. They hovered like vultures over a dying beast. Inquisitor Thrax descended upon the ruined world, a cold and suspicious executioner representing the absolute, unquestioning authority of the Inquisition. Thrax did not come to bestow honors. He came to amputate a perceived rot. Surrounded by the solemn, black-clad forms of the Black Templars acting as Thrax's honor guard, Titus faced a terrible choice. To resist would condemn the entire Adeptus Astartes chapter to suspicion, bringing the wrath of the Ordo Hereticus upon his brothers. He chose the path of the martyr. Without raising his bolter, Titus willingly surrendered his weapons and his freedom. The hero of Graia allowed himself to be bound in heavy chains. He walked into the belly of the black ship, leaving his chapter behind as the doors sealed shut and the grim voyage toward the interrogation chambers began. To surrender to the holy orders of the Emperor's Inquisition is to step into a darkness from which few ever return. Behind the adamantium bulkheads of Inquisitor Thrax's holding vessel, the hero of Graia was stripped of his armor, his honors, and his dignity. Titus was cast into sensory deprivation cells where the silence was so absolute it threatened to crush his very soul. This was no mere physical torture, for a space marine can endure the flaying of flesh without a whisper of complaint. This was theological torment. Interrogator chaplains and sanctioned psychers bombarded his mind with paradoxes of faith and endless litanies of damnation, seeking the slightest fracture in his devotion where the corruption of the warp might have taken root. Yet the mind of Titus remained an unbroken fortress. His faith in the master of mankind did not waver under the Inquisition's brutal scrutiny, for his devotion was not born of fragile scripture, but forged in the bloody reality of war. Through the endless agony, Titus realized a dark and terrible truth about the Imperium he served. Blind faith is merely a blunt weapon wielded by the ignorant and the fearful. True loyalty requires clear-eyed endurance, the strength to look upon the horrors of the galaxy and the cruelties of the Emperor's own servants without losing one's purpose. The Inquisition operates under the watchful, paranoid gaze of the Ordo Hereticus, masters of the doctrinal purge. It is they who cast the dreaded shadow of excommunicate traitoris upon those found wanting. To receive this decree is to be severed from the light of the Emperor entirely, your name erased from history, your existence declared an affront to humanity. Even to face the threat of this excommunication and survive leaves a permanent, invisible stain upon the soul. You are forever marked as a creature of suspicion, a warrior who danced too close to the precipice of heresy and was burned by the proximity. Inquisitor Thrax, scouring the very depths of the Space Marine's psyche, eventually found himself facing an infuriating truth. There was no chaotic taint within Titus. His resistance to the warp energies on Graia was an anomaly, but it was not born of dark pacts or demonic sorcery. He was utterly uncorrupted. However, the labyrinthine politics of the Imperium dictate that innocence is never enough. Titus had been accused of heresy by his own battle brother, an event so scandalous that his mere presence would sow discord and doubt within the strict hierarchy of the Ultramarines. To return him to Macragge would be politically catastrophic, an invitation for endless doctrinal schisms and friction between the Adeptus Astartes and the Inquisition. Thrax never released him. It was only when the Inquisitor himself fell to demonic possession and was purged by the Grey Knights that Titus was freed from his lightless cell. Yet, in the grim calculus of the Holy Orders, his exoneration was not an absolution. Deemed too valuable to execute but too politically tainted to return to Macragge, the Inquisition struck a pragmatically cruel bargain. The agents of the Holy Inquisition render their final judgment. They find no taint of the warp in his veins and no heresy in his soul. Yet in the grim calculus of the Imperium, innocence is merely a reprieve, never an absolution. The suspicion of his brothers has forever tainted his legacy. He cannot return to the Ultramarines, for the shadow of the Inquisition would follow him, a perpetual blight upon the sons of Guilliman. Thus, a grim bargain is struck in the cold dark. He is surrendered to the Deathwatch. To join this elite brotherhood of Xenos hunters is a supreme honor for most Adeptus Astartes, but for him, it is an exile. He is to become a Blackshield. Deep within the lightless bowels of a hidden watch fortress, the ritual of erasure begins. Servitors and tech priests approach his scarred power armor with heavy grinding wheels and solemn incense. Sparks rain upon the stone floor as the sacred cobalt blue of Macragge is violently scoured from the ceramite plates. The glorious white inverted omega, the very symbol of his proud lineage, is ground down to featureless metal. His honors, his litanies of battle, the purity seals won in rivers of Xenos blood, all are stripped away and cast into the fire. In their place comes the flat light-consuming black of the long vigil. His right pauldron is left entirely barren, wrapped in chains of penitence rather than heraldry. In this solemn undertaking, he is stripped of his rank. He is stripped of his past. He is stripped even of his name. Captain Titus ceases to exist. Only a Null Nomen remains. He is a ghost encased in black iron, a warrior without a history, condemned to fight for a redemption he knows he may never receive. The watch fortress itself mirrors the bleakness of his soul. It is an austere, monastic citadel suspended in the void, where the only music is the tolling of solemn bells and the rhythmic chanting of martial vows. Here, warriors from 100 different chapters train, meditate, and prepare for war against the Xenos menace. Yet among this brotherhood of champions, the Null Nomen walks in profound psychological isolation. The other Space Marines bear the proud colours of their parent chapters on their right shoulders, exchanging tales of distant homeworlds and ancestral primarchs. The Blackshield has no homeworld to speak of, and no father to invoke. He is bound by an oath of absolute silence regarding his origins. His brothers in the Deathwatch do not ask what sin brought him to their ranks, for the black armor commands a grim and respectful distance. He is completely alone in a fortress of warriors, carrying the crushing weight of a crime he did not commit. Every bolter shell he loads and every blade he sharpens is a silent prayer to the Emperor. He has no legacy left to protect, only a duty that must be discharged in the blood of the enemy. The Watch Commander looks upon this nameless veteran and recognizes a weapon forged in the fires of ultimate loss. New orders are given, and the black-hulled strike cruisers prepare to translate into the Imperium to begin a century of silent penance. He was no longer a captain of the Adeptus Astartes. He was a shadow bound in blackened ceramite, a Blackshield consigned to the deepest voids where the Imperium sends its most burdened sons to die. For 100 years, the warrior once known as Titus served the Deathwatch in a suffocating silence. It was a century forged in the crucible of suicidal compliance, deployed to the bleeding edges of the galaxy where survival was often viewed as a failure of duty. He sought the Emperor's peace through honorable annihilation, yet the grim irony of his existence was that he could not fall. Kill team after kill team perished around him, their names added to the shadowed martyrs of the Long Watch, while the disgraced exile remained standing. He endured the temporal migrations of the Hrud, wading through distortion fields that aged his battle brothers to dust in mere seconds. He felt the unnatural chill of entropic decay wash over his own flesh, his transhuman biology resisting the rapid theft of centuries. He emerged scarred by time itself, older and harder, but unbroken. When the Barghezi threatened to break their containment blockades, it was this nameless Blackshield who met their hyper-violence with a brutality that defied mortal measure. He plunged into the claustrophobic nightmare of deep void mining colonies, purging insidious genestealer cults in absolute darkness. In those suffocating tunnels, he slaughtered aberrations born of the Tyranid menace, wading through rivers of Xenos ichor, while the horrors of the brood tore his comrades limb from limb. He watched worthy warriors die in the mud, in the void, and in the dark. Each death was a heavy stone upon his soul, yet his stoicism remained an impenetrable fortress. He absorbed the endless loss, compartmentalizing the guilt of outliving brothers who carried no taint of suspicion. This century of unending slaughter stripped away whatever remnants of ego had survived his exile. There was no glory to be found in the black armor. There were no roaring crowds of Macragge to sing his praises, no chapter banners to hoist above conquered battlefields. There was only the mission, the bolter, and the blood. He was reduced to the purest essence of a space marine, a weapon of absolute execution devoid of pride or personal ambition. His secret identity became a sealed tomb in which his past was buried, allowing his present to function as a flawless instrument of the Emperor's wrath. Yet even a weapon forged of such relentless conviction cannot strike against the anvil of the galaxy forever without fracturing. The century of silence demanded a toll in flesh and bone, a debt of agony that the uncaring universe was finally coming to collect. The shadows of the fringe were converging, guiding his kill team toward a nightmare deployment that would not merely test his unyielding spirit, but tear his physical form to pieces. A century of seeking oblivion finally yielded its reward in the lightless depths of a dying, nameless world. The Tyranid swarm had completely stripped the atmosphere, leaving only choking ash, toxic spores, and the deafening chittering of the great devourer. Here, amidst a ruined cathedral dedicated to a silent god, Titus found the bloody culmination of his long penance. Looming from the poisonous fog was a carnifex of impossible proportions, a living siege engine clad in impenetrable chitin and dripping with hypercorrosive bioacid. His heavy bolter was already empty, the sacred weapon reduced to a hollow bludgeon in his trembling gauntlet. There was no retreat, no tactical withdrawal, and no brothers left standing to watch his final stand. There was only the brutal mathematics of a lone warrior fighting to the absolute last breath. Titus threw himself at the apex beast with a roar that rivaled the monster's own Xenos shriek. His chainsword bit deep into the creature's heavily armored joints, showering him in scalding, toxic ichor. The Xeno's blood burned straight through his blackened ceramite, searing away the silver Inquisition heraldry and eating viciously into his gene-enhanced flesh. In savage retaliation, the beast swung a massive scything talon with the kinetic force of a falling gunship. The sheer impact shattered the left side of his breastplate entirely. Thick ceramite plating turned to lethal shrapnel, driving deep into his fused ribcage. His primary heart ruptured instantly in a catastrophic burst of crimson. The shock was absolute, a blinding, paralyzing agony that would have immediately extinguished the life of any mortal man. Yet Titus fought on through the blinding haze of his own destruction, his secondary heart pumping furiously to keep the failing biological machine of his body alive for just a few moments more. Summoning the last reserves of his superhuman strength, he drove his sparking blade violently upward, burying the roaring teeth directly through the jaw and into the brain cavity of the screaming monster. The carnifex thrashed wildly in its violent death throes, ultimately collapsing and crushing Titus beneath a mountain of spasming armored bulk. His spine was fractured in multiple places. His augmented lungs were rapidly filling with his own blood and acidic vapor. Titus lay broken upon a throne of slaughtered Xenos, entirely unable to move his ruined limbs. Yet as the cold numbness of a void-like sleep began to creep into his fading vision, he did not feel fear or despair. He felt a profound, holy peace wash over his battered soul. The impossible, crushing burden of his century-long exile was finally lifting. He had spent 100 grueling years throwing his life into the merciless jaws of death to atone for a corruption he never possessed, and finally, the master of mankind had accepted his currency. The toxic fires slowly faded from his ruined nerve endings. The deafening roar of the Xenos swarm grew distant, replaced by a deep, welcoming and silent dark. His lone remaining heart slowed its frantic rhythm, beating a final sluggish cadence before giving in to the inevitable stillness. Titus closed his eyes, gladly embracing the eternal rest he had so violently and dutifully earned. He slipped completely into the quiet abyss of a deathly coma, his shattered form hidden in the darkness, utterly buried beneath the bleeding corpses of his foes. Through the choking ash of a murdered world, the stormbirds of the Ultramarines descended like avenging angels. They came in answer to a singular, desperate cry in the dark, a Deathwatch distress beacon screaming its final lament into the void. What the strike force found amidst the ruins was a slaughterhouse. Mutilated Xenos corpses lay in mountainous heaps, paid for by the shattered armor of the Emperor's finest. At the epicenter of this carnage lay a lone Blackshield, his armor stripped of all heraldry, his flesh torn open by mortal wounds. An apothecary of the Ultramarines knelt in the blood-soaked dirt to perform the final sacred rites of the fallen. He engaged his narthecium to harvest the progenoid glands, expecting to find the anonymous genetic legacy of a warrior who had forsaken his past. Instead, the cogitator arrays chimed with a frantic, impossible dissonance. The holy algorithms did not merely register a son of Guilliman. The blood tied itself to a genetic matrix, long thought erased from the active rolls of the chapter. The apothecary wiped the grime from the dying warrior's scarred face, a profound awe warring with cold disbelief in his twin hearts. This broken, nameless exile was Demetrian Titus, the legendary and lost captain of the Second Company. Word spread through the strike force as a hushed, reverent whisper. The prodigal son, taken in chains by the Inquisition over a century prior, had fought on in the shadows. He had endured shame, exile, and endless war, only to fall upon this forgotten rock. With utmost urgency, the ruined body of the former captain was sealed within a stasis field. The temporal displacement froze the blood spilling from his sundered armor, arresting his final heartbeat in a crystalline suspension of time. The extraction to the orbiting strike cruiser was a swift, silent procession. Within the ship's apothecarian, the suspended form of Titus became the subject of grim evaluation. The attending apothecaries and Captain Acheron looked upon the ruin of a legend. His body was too ravaged by the vile weapons of the enemy, his organs failing, his immense transhuman resilience entirely exhausted. It was clear that standard Medicae procedures would not save him. Recognizing the unyielding fire that still burned within the veteran's suspended soul, Acheron made a fateful decision, weighing the risk of attempting a terrible miracle. To save a warrior broken beyond the limits of even Astartes' physiology, there was only one path remaining. Titus was laid upon the cold marble of the surgical apothecarian, a slab reserved for those who must cross the Rubicon prima ris. The grim surgery began not with a prayer of healing, but with the brutal mechanical violence of a butcher's yard. Servitors armed with diamond-tipped bone saws and adamantium retractors descended upon his ruined form. To remake a space marine, he must first be unmade. The fused, bulletproof mass of his osmodular-enhanced ribcage was brutally cleaved open, the sound of shattering bone echoing through the incense-choked chamber. Blood, thick with the sacred genocide of Guilliman, spilled across the altar as the flesh was peeled back to expose his failing hearts. Into this ruin of anatomy, the apothecaries thrust the miraculous and terrifying gifts of Belisarius' call. First came the Magnificat, embedded deep within the brain, an organ designed to secrete hormones that force the body into a violent, agonizing phase of hypergrowth. Then, the sinew coils were interwoven with his very musculature. Miles of durasteel cabling were threaded through torn flesh and bound to his bones, replacing humanity with an unyielding metallic strength. Every nerve ending screamed in defiance as the arcane machinery violated his mortal frame. Finally, the Belisarian furnace was grafted to his twin hearts. This was the dormant crucible of his resurrection, an alchemical gland that would flood his system with regenerative combat stims only when the body reached the absolute precipice of oblivion. But to cross the Rubicon Primaris, one must first drown in its depths. The Calgarian rites demand the ultimate toll from the subject. Titus had to die. The surgical trauma reached its catastrophic peak, and the continuous thud of his twin hearts abruptly ceased. The medici cogitators emitted a monotone drone of expiration, signaling that the transhuman biology had finally failed, casting the soul of the captain adrift into the dark void. In the early days of the Ultima founding, to attempt this surgery was to court almost certain destruction. The mortality rate among firstborn initiates was staggering, leaving chapter halls filled with the butchered corpses of their greatest heroes. It is viewed by the priesthood of Mars as a supreme gift of the Omnisire, a flawless biological machine grafted unto mortal weakness. Yet, for the Adeptus Astartes, it is understood as a lethal trial of the soul, a judgment from the Emperor himself to determine if a warrior is worthy of the future. For agonizing minutes, Titus lay as a corpse upon the slab, cold and devoid of life. The spiritual agony of the void tore at his essence, a silent war fought in the unseen realms where demons hunger for the souls of the Emperor's chosen. Just as the attending apothecaries prepared to record his failure and harvest his progenoid glands, the Belisarian furnace awakened. Ignited by the absolute death of the host, the organ flooded his stagnant veins with a torrential cocktail of hyperadrenal synthetics. A violent spasm arched his broken spine off the marble. With a thunderous, wet rhythm, his newly augmented heart slammed back into life. The immense, heavily scarred chest heaved, pulling in a ragged gasp of sanctified air. The eyes of Demetrian Titus snapped open, blazing with a cold, renewed fury as his mind registered the terrifying strength of his second life. The crossing of the Rubicon Primaris is a literal death and a violent resurrection, and Demetrian Titus awoke to find himself a stranger within his own flesh. The first breaths he drew as a newborn giant felt impossibly deep, his enhanced lungs pulling the cold air of the apothecarian into a chest that had been radically expanded. He rose from the surgical slab not merely repaired, but fundamentally remade. The sheer physical power cascading through his augmented musculature delivered a profound sensory shock. He stood taller than he ever had in his centuries of war, his center of gravity shifted, his twin hearts thudding in tandem with the Xenos rhythm of the Belisarian furnace. Yet for all this newfound strength, a crushing alienation settled over his mind. He looked down at his own hands, hands that had slaughtered countless enemies in the name of Macragge, and found them unrecognizable. He was draped once more in the pristine cobalt blue of the Ultramarines. These were the very colors he had been forced to scrape from his armor when he was dragged away in chains, condemned to a century of shame and hidden warfare. To wear the chapter heraldry again should have been a moment of triumphant vindication. Instead, it felt like the ceremonial garb of a restless ghost. He had endured 100 years of relentless torture, brutal interrogations by the Inquisition, and suicidal deployments among the Blackshields of the Deathwatch. He had survived it all through sheer, unyielding loyalty. But the galaxy he had bled for during his long exile was utterly gone. As he emerged from the apothecarian, the grim reality of the new millennium was laid bare before him. The chaplains and chroniclers spoke of impossibilities made horribly manifest. They told him of the Cicatrix Maledictum, the great rift that had violently torn the galaxy in half and drowned 1,000,000 worlds in warp madness. They spoke of the Noctis Aeterna, a long, suffocating night where the divine light of the Astronomicon had guttered and died. Most staggering of all, they declared that the avenging sun, the Primarch Guilliman, had risen from 10,000 years of stasis to command the Imperium once more. Titus absorbed these world-shattering truths with a heavy, solitary silence. He had finally returned home, only to find that his home had been swallowed by a cosmic nightmare. He was a man violently ripped out of time, a veteran of a bygone era thrust into an infinitely darker and more fractured reality. The Space Marines of this new age were strangers to him, bred in Martian vaults and unleashed upon a dying cosmos to stem the bleeding of a broken empire. He was now one of them in physical form, yet his soul remained tethered to the chapter he had once proudly led as a captain. The veterans he fought alongside were long dead, his ancient comrades reduced to ash and faded memory. Titus realized with bitter clarity that surviving the Inquisition was only the prologue to his trials. He had earned his redemption, but the chapter he returned to was unrecognizable, bound by rigid new decrees and governed by unfamiliar faces. With a heavy heart, the newborn Primaris Marine prepared to walk the hallowed halls of his fortress, marching into a labyrinth of bureaucracy to face judgment from battle brothers who knew only his legend and his disgrace. To cross the Rubicon Primaris is to be reborn, but rebirth does not turn back the clock of the galaxy. Titus awoke to an Imperium forever altered by the Era Indomitus, and a chapter that had long ago closed the ledger on his command. The Inquisition had found no corruption in his soul, wiping the stain of heresy from his name. Yet exoneration in the eyes of the Ordo Hereticus does not equate to a seamless restoration within the Adeptus Astartes. More than a century had ground away in his absence. The Ultramarines had endured without him. The Second Company, his beloved brotherhood, had forged a new legacy, and they had done so under the guidance of a new master. To understand the gravity of his return is to understand the sacred and unyielding structure of the Codex Astartes. A Space Marine company is a rigid organism, a brotherhood of exactly 100 warriors bound by a chain of command that brooks no deviation. At its apex stands the captain, a paragon of martial virtue whose authority is absolute. When a captain falls, another ascends, and the lineage remains unbroken. For a living captain to return from exile and find another upon his throne is a circumstance almost entirely unprecedented in the annals of Macragge. There is no provision for dual leadership. There is no gentle retirement. A Space Marine leads until death, or he serves those who have taken his place. Thus came the humbling reality of his reintegration. Titus stood before Sevastus Acheran, the reigning captain of the Second Company, the very man who now held the title and the burdens that Titus had once borne. Acheran looked upon the legendary warrior with a mixture of reverence and undeniable caution. The decree was handed down with the cold, administrative finality characteristic of the sons of Guilliman. Titus was to be stripped of his former rank. He would serve not as a captain, but as a lieutenant. Titus accepted the demotion without a single word of protest. His face remained a mask of transhuman stoicism, his posture rigid and deferential to his new commanding officer. He offered no complaints regarding the decades of torture he had endured, nor did he demand the respect owed to his former station. But beneath that armoured discipline, the bitter sting of demotion festered. It was a quiet, unspoken judgment handed down by his own chapter. The masters of Macragge trusted his gene seed, they trusted his bolter, and they trusted his righteous fury. They trusted him enough to let him bleed for the Emperor, but they did not trust him enough to let him lead as he once did. The shadow of suspicion, though officially banished, still lingered in the margins of their brotherhood. There would be no time to dwell upon wounded pride or the ghosts of his past command. The galaxy was burning, and the Imperium demanded the tithe of war. Acheran did not waste the lethal potential of the veterans standing before him. Orders were issued, coordinates were set, and Titus found himself immediately thrust into the suffocating nightmare of the Tyranid threat. Stripped of his former rank and bearing the newly minted markings of a lieutenant, Titus descends into the suffocating nightmare of the Tyranid War. Here, the galaxy itself is being devoured. The skies of Kadaku are thick with microscopic bioforms, turning the air into a choking, humid soup that burns the lungs and obscures the sun. The once verdant jungles of that doomed world are dissolved into putrid Xenos slurry, harvested by a relentless Xenos ecology. On Avarax, the towering hive cities are blanketed in a suffocating shroud of spore-laden fog. where rusted ferrocrete foundations crumble beneath the weight of 1 billion chitinous claws. This is a war of apocalyptic scale, a mindless and consuming tide of flesh and hunger that threatens to swallow the Imperium whole. Yet against the backdrop of this unfathomable galactic predation, a singular, intensely localized trauma anchors the soul of Demetrian Titus. He carries the invisible scars of betrayal and the lingering shadows of the Inquisition. To survive the crushing weight of his own doubts, the former captain buries his mind in the absolute clarity of unending warfare. There is no longer a place for the roaring defiance or the reckless glory of a young commander leading from the front with a hopeful heart. That man died in the interrogation chambers of the Ordo Malleus. What remains on the battlefields of Kadaku and Avarax is a weapon forged in the absolute darkness of the Deathwatch. Titus fights not with fiery rhetoric, but with a brutal, hyper-efficient lethality. He moves through the screaming bio-horrors as a silent executioner. Every parry, every thrust of his chainsword, and every bark of his bolter is measured, calculated, and utterly devastating. Where the Tyranid swarm is chaotic and endlessly loud, Titus is the quiet center of the slaughter. He conserves his energy, exploiting the anatomical weaknesses of Xenos beasts, with the muscle memory of a veteran who has spent decades hunting the most dangerous terrors of the void. The shrieks of Hormagaunts and the bellowing roars of Carnifexes wash over him, but he remains completely detached, an island of cold ceramite amidst a surging ocean of razor-sharp talons. He is a machine of death, entirely consumed by the mechanics of survival and the grim necessity of his duty. But the Tyranid threat is a beast that cannot be slain by a single blade, no matter how sharp or hardened that blade might be. The sheer endless mathematics of the swarm dictate that even a veteran of the Deathwatch will eventually drown in the tide of bodies. Titus realizes that his silent penance and isolated butchery are not enough to stem the rot consuming this sector. The war requires more than a solitary killer. It requires the very thing he has learned to fear, the bonds of brotherhood and the heavy burden of trust. He must look to the warriors standing beside him in the blood-soaked mud. The blood of the Tyranid swarm still burned upon the ceramite of their armor, but a colder peril lingered in the silence between firefights on Kadaku. To lead the Adeptus Astartes is to forge a brotherhood bound by unshakable faith, yet Lieutenant Titus walked isolated among his own kin. Behind the visors of Chiron and Gadriel, there was no reverence for a returned hero. There was only the icy, unblinking vigil of suspicion. They knew the whispers that shadowed his name. They knew the Inquisition had taken him, spiriting him away into the darkest oubliettes where the taint of the arch-enemy is purged with holy fire. To return from such captivity is a miracle, but to the rigid dogma of the Prima Res generation, it is a glaring anomaly that reeks of hidden corruption. Every command Titus issued was met with the fractional hesitation of men waiting for a traitor to reveal his true colors. A lesser commander would have met this insubordination with the crack of a power maul or roaring demands for obedience. Titus did neither. He bore the weight of their mistrust with the weary patience of a veteran who has seen the galaxy burn 1,000 times over. He understood their fear. He knew that in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, blind trust is the first step toward damnation. He would not demand their loyalty through the authority of his rank. He would forge it in the only crucible that mattered. The turning point did not come through stirring oratory, but in the suffocating gloom of the jungle undergrowth. Without warning, the shadows themselves parted as a Tyranid lictor materialized from the weeping canopy, its scything talons aimed directly at the blind side of Gadriel. There was no time for warning shouts, nor for the roar of a bolter. Titus did not issue a command. He moved with the blurring speed of a Primarch's wrath, throwing his own immense bulk between the Xenos assassin and his subordinate. The wicked bone blade, designed to cleave through heavy armor, tore through the pauldron of the lieutenant, biting deep into his transhuman flesh. Blood spilled across the Xenos soil, but it was not the tainted, warp-touched ichor they secretly feared to see. It was the rich, genetically augmented blood of the Adeptus Astartes, shed willingly for a brother who had offered him nothing but scorn. With a feral roar, Titus seized the offending limb, his chainsword revving to a deafening pitch as he drove the roaring teeth upward, eviscerating the monstrous beast from abdomen to throat. The creature collapsed in a ruined heap, its acidic lifeblood smoking against the jungle floor. Titus did not look to Gadriel for gratitude. He did not speak of the wound, nor did he use the moment to castigate the squad for their lack of awareness. He simply bound the deepest gash, reloaded his weapon, and pointed his blade deeper into the swarm. In that heavy, breathless silence, the impenetrable wall of suspicion began to crack. Chiron and Gadriel looked upon their commander, seeing not a suspected heretic, but an angel of death who placed the lives of his battle brothers above his own pride. The shadows of mistrust were retreating, but the ultimate trial of their forged brotherhood still awaited them in the encroaching dark. The suffocating shadow of suspicion that had choked his brothers finally breaks, shattered not by words, but by the revelation of the true architect of the slaughter. The Tyranid swarm, for all its mindless hunger, was but a biological smokescreen. Behind the chitin and the screeching hordes stood the true enemy, draped in the blue and gold of a fallen age. The Thousand Suns had come. Traitors to the Emperor, slaves to the architect of fate, they had pulled the strings of the hive mind to plunge the world into darkness. In their arrogant mastery of the Imperium, they brought with them the very nightmare that Demetrian Titus had been accused of harboring. The Inquisition had caged him for a century, convinced that his resistance to the warp was a symptom of its taint. Now the true practitioners of warp sorcery stand before him, commanding unholy fire and twisting the fabric of reality itself. The chaos sorcerer Imura looks upon the returned lieutenant with the haughty disdain of a god looking upon a mortal insect. Imura weaves the raw stuff of the warp, unleashing warp fire and psychic malice intended to break the spirit of the Ultramarine. Yet, in this crucible of arcane horrors, the truth of Titus is finally forged in undeniable iron. Where a corrupted soul would resonate with the sorcery, Titus stands as a bulwark of absolute defiance. He does not bend, he does not break. He is the wrath of Macragge made manifest. Through storms of psychic lightning and the shattered glass of reality, Titus charges. He rejects the whispers of the warp with every swing of his chainsword and every roar of his bolt pistol. The sorcery of Tzeentch crashes against his armor, but it cannot pierce the fortress of his unyielding faith. His brothers watch as the man they doubted wades through the profane fires of the arch-enemy. When Titus closes the distance, the arrogance of the sorcerer dissolves into desperate panic. There is no elegant duel of minds, only the brutal mechanical execution of a traitor. Titus brings his blade down, tearing through psychic wards and mutated flesh alike. Though the sorcerer laughs and dissolves into warp fire to flee the physical plane, the clash leaves a profound impact. In the ringing silence that follows his retreat, the lingering ghosts of a century of torment are momentarily exorcised. The squad of Primaris Marines, who had measured every breath Titus took for signs of heresy, now see him in the purest light of the imperial truth. He has waded through the deepest corruption and emerged untouched. His mind is clear, and his soul belongs entirely to Macragge and the master of mankind. The broader war rages on, yet this singular display of unyielding faith paves a righteous path of trust among his brothers. The warp-born ashes of the Thousand Suns had barely settled after their initial skirmish before the true gravity of the conflict was recognized. Within the cavernous stratagem of the Ultramarines battle barge, the air was heavy with the scent of sanctified incense and the silent reverence of the Adeptus Astartes. The grand vessel served as the beating heart of the chapter's retribution fleet in the Residius system, its adamantium halls echoing with the grim purpose of unyielding war. Beneath hanging banners that chronicled 10,000 years of unyielding war, Demetrian Titus stood waiting. He was no longer a suspected heretic, no longer a nameless Blackshield bleeding in the midnight armor of the Deathwatch. He was a true son of Macragge, bathed once more in the golden light of his ancestral home. Stepping forth from the shadows of the Strategium's tactical hololithic displays, Marneus Calgar revealed his imposing presence. The chapter master had arrived in system, and his rhythmic footfalls echoed like thunder against the deck plates, a testament to the absolute authority he wielded. In his massive relic-wrought gauntlets, Calgar bore the ancient heraldry of the Second Company. Though Captain Acheron retained command of the Second, a unique mantle of vanguard leadership was forged for the warrior who had proven his unyielding worth. Calgar paused before Titus, his ancient eyes reading the profound depths of the newly forged Primaris warrior. There was no lingering doubt in the gaze of the chapter master, only the unspoken pride of a patriarch recognizing the unbreakable spirit of his most enduring son. With measured reverence, Calgar personally secured the purity seals and honorifics of a recognized veteran upon the armor of Titus. The sacred oaths of brotherhood were spoken, echoing off the vaulted ceilings, and for the first time in over a century of agonizing exile, Titus was whole. He had fought through the bitterest darkness to reclaim his name, his place, and his pristine honor. Yet beneath the immaculately polished ceramite and the roaring choruses of his assembled battle brothers, a suffocating melancholy anchored his soul. The man who had been stripped of his command so long ago on the forge world of Graia was dead. He had been meticulously dismantled by 100 years of relentless suspicion, by the cold tortures of the Inquisition, and by the tearing agony of the Rubicon Primaris. The colossal giant who now wore the golden eagle of the Second Company was an entirely different weapon. He was a living monument to duty, forged in the darkest pits of isolation. Every scar that marred his flesh whispered of sacrifices his cheering brothers could never fully comprehend. Vindication is a notoriously heavy burden, for it forces the vindicated to carry the permanent memory of the injustice that preceded it. Titus accepted his new role not with the arrogant triumph of a conqueror, but with the grim solemnity of a martyr who had somehow survived the cleansing fire. His restoration was absolute, a shining beacon of impossible resilience that echoed far beyond the majestic walls of the fortress of Hera. Such an extraordinary tale of loyalty and unyielding defiance against the twisted sorcery of the arch-enemy could not remain confined to the localized annals of Macragge. The triumphant resurgence of the legendary captain sent energetic ripples through the warp and across the astropathic choirs of the beleaguered Imperium. It was a brilliant spark in a galaxy consumed by shadows, an anomaly of hope that inevitably caught the unblinking gaze of the highest absolute authority left to mankind. The ink upon his reinstatement was barely dry before the summons came. Titus, recognized anew for his unyielding loyalty, was called to the inner sanctum of the battle barge. To stand before Marneus Calgar is to stand before the concentrated majesty of Macragge's supreme martial architect. As the heavy adamantium doors sealed behind him, Titus felt the sheer, crushing weight of a living demigod. It was not a deliberate psychic assault, but the undeniable gravitational pull of a legendary commander whose will had been forged in a century of unbroken apocalyptic warfare. The very air of the chamber grew thick, thrumming with a golden resonance that forced the breath from the transhuman lungs of the Space Marine. Titus immediately dropped to one knee, bowing his scarred head before the chapter master. Yet when Calgar finally spoke, his voice did not boom with the righteous thunder of an unyielding conqueror. It was quiet, rich with an indescribable exhaustion that spanned the millennia. Calgar commanded the lieutenant to rise, looking upon the veteran warrior not as a mere instrument of war, but as a kindred soul. The chapter master stepped down from his elevated dais, the armor of Antilochus whirring softly with the esoteric mechanisms that amplified his strength. He looked deep into the eyes of Demetrian Titus and saw a profound mirror of his own grueling trial crossing the Rubicon Primaris. "You are a warrior out of time, Titus," Calgar murmured, his words heavy with the weight of unyielding command. The chapter master spoke of the galaxy the veteran had awakened to find, a decaying carcass sustained only by superstition and blind dogma. Like the ancient heroes of myth, Titus had been torn from his proper era, cast into the dark, and forced to endure the relentless suspicion of the very brothers he bled to protect. They shared the unique, isolating agony of holding on to the noble ideals of the past, only to serve an Imperium drowning in fearful ignorance. Titus stood resolute, absorbing the immense sorrow of his chapter master without breaking eye contact. For a fleeting moment, the suffocating, transhuman aura of the Lord of Macragge lessened, replaced by a profound, quiet understanding between the two veterans. Calgar confessed that the greatest burden of their eternal duty was not fighting the endless tides of chaos or the Xenos menace. The true burden was bearing the dogmatic failures of the fractured humanity they were sworn to save. The Inquisition had tortured and imprisoned Titus for his resilience, just as the High Lords of Terror had secretly balked at the return of the Primarch. "You and I," Calgar said, his gaze piercing through the ceramite armor and into the very soul of the lieutenant, "we fight for a dream that this galaxy has long forgotten, but we fight nonetheless." Titus felt a renewed fire ignite within his twin hearts, realizing that his century of exile and shame had not been a punishment, but a sacred forge. Calgar turned away, looking out toward the star-strewn void through the vast armor-glass viewport. The weariness in the posture of the chapter master shifted, hardening once more into the pragmatic resolve of a supreme tactician. There was a specific reason Titus had been preserved through the centuries. There was a reason he had survived the crossing of the Rubicon Primaris and been restored to the ranks of his chapter. Calgar slowly turned back to face him, the cold light of his intellect burning away the shadows of the sanctum, ready to bestow a burden that would alter the fate of the sector forever. The doors of the chapter master's sanctum closed behind Titus, leaving the newly reinstated lieutenant with a burden as vast as the stars themselves. The mandate delivered by Marneus Calgar was absolute. It was a command not merely to hold the line, but to exact a total and unforgiving purge of the Xenos taint threatening the borders of Ultramar. Once this stellar realm was the undisputed jewel of the Eastern Fringe, a shining beacon of order and prosperity amid the suffocating darkness of a dying galaxy. It was the dream of the Emperor made manifest, an empire of logic, enlightenment, and unyielding martial pride. But the millennia have been cruel to the realm of Macragge. The great rift tore the sky asunder, and through that bleeding wound poured the suffocating rot of the plague wars. The Death Guard and the sprawling legions of Nurgle transformed pristine agri-worlds into festering nightmare landscapes of virulent decay. Where the plague receded, the ravenous shadow of the Tyranid hive fleets fell upon the weary survivors. Billions of loyal souls were consumed, their flesh and bones stripped away by the chittering Xenos horrors that continuously ravaged the eastern galactic rim. Ultramar is fractured, bleeding from 1,000 wounds, its borders besieged by terrors that defy mortal comprehension. To heal such a devastating wound, Guilliman understood that standard defensive doctrines would no longer suffice. The chapter master looked upon the rigid strictures of the Codex Astartes and saw a sacred tome that could become a cage for lesser minds. He required a commander who possessed the vision to see beyond the dogma. He needed a warrior who understood the spirit of the law rather than crumbling under the weight of its absolute letter. This is the very reason Calgar chose Demetrian Titus. Titus had been cast down into the darkest pits of suspicion and despair by his own brothers. He had endured the relentless scrutiny of the Inquisition, survived the insidious whispers of the Imperium, and walked through the agonizing fires of his own death and rebirth as a Primaris space marine. Titus knows the galaxy for the treacherous slaughterhouse that it truly is. He has seen the Imperium at its absolute worst, betrayed by those he fought to protect, yet his loyalty to the Golden Throne remains utterly unbroken. Calgar saw in him a living weapon forged by tragedy, and tempered by unparalleled resilience. Titus is not a mere strategist following ancient rubrics of war. He is a pragmatist born of the blood-soaked battlefield, a survivor who will employ any unorthodox tactic required to ensure the survival of humanity. The chapter master named him the vanguard and the spearhead of this new offensive. It is a sacred, blood-bound duty to cleanse the tainted soil, to burn away the Xenos and the Heretic, and to restore the shattered crown of the 500 worlds. The staggering weight of a broken empire now rests squarely upon his armored shoulders. He carries the singular blessing of his chapter master, a mandate forged in desperation and undeniable martial fury. There is no time for doubt, and no room for hesitation in the brutal calculus of galactic war. Titus must now turn his gaze outward to the ruined stars and begin the colossal task of gathering his vanguard forces. The rebirth of Lieutenant Titus was forged not in the safety of a fortress monastery, but in the suffocating crucible of Kadaku. There was no time to mourn the man he had been, nor to fully master the augmented musculature of his new prima ris physiology. He was thrust immediately into the maw of the Great Devourer. The final, agonizing hours of the jungle world of Kadaku were a testament to the sheer, crushing weight of Hive Fleet Leviathan. Looking to the heavens, the Imperial defenders did not see a sky, but a bruised canopy of descending Xenos biomatter. Millions of fleshy tyrannocytes blotted out the sun, disgorging horrors upon a world that was already dying. The verdant jungles of Kadaku were rapidly reduced to a horrific slurry of digestive acids, Xenos ichor, and the blood of the Imperial Guard. This is the true terror of a Tyranid invasion, culminating in the birth of the capillary towers. To witness these grotesque structures is to gaze upon the parasitic feeding tubes of a cosmic predator. These colossal spires of chitin and sinew root themselves deep into the planetary crust, piercing the mantle to literally drink the oceans and inhale the atmosphere. They siphon the entire biological and chemical makeup of the world upward into the waiting bioships, leaving nothing behind but a barren, airless rock floating in the void. Against this planetary consumption, the Adeptus Astartes are mighty, but they are not invincible. Titus understood this grim reality, framing his leadership not around the pursuit of a glorious victory, but by orchestrating a desperate, tactical delay. Every bolter shell fired and every chainsword swing was a transaction paid in blood to buy the retreating forces a fraction of a second. He led his new squadmates, Chiron and Gadriel, in a grueling fighting retreat toward the last remaining planetary defense lasers. The tension between the three Ultramarines was as thick as the spore-choked air. Chiron and Gadriel fought with the flawless precision of their prima ris generation, yet they watched their new commander with a volatile mixture of awe and lingering suspicion. Titus was an outsider in his own chapter, a relic forced to fight a war of attrition that pushed their transhuman endurance to its absolute limit. Endless, scuttling tides of Hormagaunts threw themselves onto the Space Marines in sacrificial waves, burying the Astartes under the sheer mass of their own dead. Towering Tyranid warriors waded through the slaughter, their bioweapons tearing great chunks from the ceramite armor of the Ultramarines. Muscles burned and dual hearts strained against their ribs as the Space Marines fought step by bloody step through the corrosive mud. Despite their superhuman valor, Kadaku was already lost to the feeding swarm. The defense lasers could only offer a momentary reprieve, a brief window of fire to cover their extraction from a doomed world. As the capillary towers drank the last of the jungle world, the tactical reality forced the battered Ultramarines to abandon the surface. They would have to fall back to the neighboring hive world of Avarax, leaving the rotting biomass behind for a suffocating expanse of steel and urban sprawl. Kadaku drowned in a tide of Xenos flesh, proving that conventional doctrines of planetary defense are utterly useless against the new adaptations of Hive Fleet Leviathan. The shadow in the warp now engulfs Avarax. To look upon Avarax is to gaze into the brutalist Gothic soul of the Adeptus Mechanicus. It is a world not of soil and foliage, but of endless steel, rust, and grinding macro-manufactorums that pierce the smog-choked heavens. The contrast to the sprawling organic nightmare of Kadaku is absolute, yet the horror that has descended upon this forge world is identical. Avarax cannot be allowed to fall. It is a vital organ in the anatomy of the 500 worlds of Ultramar. The tireless assembly lines of this planet produce the very bolt shells and munitions that the Ultramarines require to wage their eternal war. If the fires of Avarax are extinguished by the Xenos swarm, the bolters of the Adeptus Astartes will soon fall silent across the entire sector. The defense of Avarax has degenerated into an urban meat grinder of unimaginable scale. The Great Devourer does not merely consume, it calculates, it adapts, and it overcomes. To deploy towering bio-titans within the suffocating narrow corridors of a hive city would be a tactical waste. Instead, the hive mind has shifted its biological production to favor vanguard organisms perfectly suited for the claustrophobic nightmare of urban warfare. Lictors stalk through the labyrinthine ventilation shafts, using their chameleonic skin to bleed into the rusted bulkheads before butchering patrols in the dark. Pure-restrained gin-stealers boil up from the abyssal depths of the underhive. They ambush desperate defense forces in the shadows of the manufactorums, turning every hab block and maintenance corridor into a slaughterhouse. There are no grand battle lines here, only frantic point-blank skirmishes fought in darkness and blood. Lieutenant Titus has been forced into this suffocating close-quarters hell. There is no room for sweeping strategic maneuvers, only the brutal roar of his chainsword and the deafening crack of his bolt pistol in confined spaces. Yet amidst the carnage of the upper hive, a darker truth begins to manifest. The Adeptus Mechanicus forces on Avarax are not fighting a conventional war of survival. The ruling tech priests are acting with infuriating evasion. They calculate the loss of civilian life as a mere mathematical rounding error, abandoning massive population centers to the Tyranid swarms. Instead of reinforcing the critical planetary defense grids, they are redirecting their elite Skitarii maniples to secure seemingly empty sublevels and deep subterranean vaults. Titus knows the rigidly logical priesthood of Mars does nothing without reason. Their binary cant speaks of preservation, but their troop movements speak of a profound and desperate concealment. The Mechanicus is deliberately bleeding the planet dry to buy time for unknown assets, prioritizing a shadow operation over the survival of their own world. Somewhere deep beneath the rusted crust of Avarax, obscured by oceans of Tyranid dead and millions of slaughtered workers, the machine lords are hiding something massive. The retreat of the tech priesthood from the upper hive was no act of cowardice, but one of cold, calculated preservation. Titus, Chiron, and Gadriel pressed beneath the grinding gears of Avarax, descending into the Stygian depths of an Archmagos's hidden sanctum. What they found within the gloom was not the bioorganic rot of the Xenos, but a slaughter of a far more sinister design. Dozens of Skitarii vanguard lay strewn across the cold iron decking. Their augmented bodies were not torn asunder by the scything talons of the Tyranid swarms, nor melted by corrosive bioplasma. Instead, their bionic limbs and scorched armor were fused together by the unnatural heat of warp fire. Jagged, iridescent crystalline growths erupted from their iron lungs and shattered visors, casting a sickly prismatic glow over the rusted bulkheads. Lieutenant Titus recognized the foul signatures immediately. His centuries of service within the Deathwatch had taught him to identify the myriad faces of damnation, and his deep-seated suspicions of the Mechanicus were now completely validated. Beside him, Gadriel gripped his bolter tighter, his soul already shivering from the subtle, oily taint of the Imperium that hung heavy in the stagnant air. This shadowed facility was the cradle of Project Aurora. Buried data ghosts within the strategic cogitators spoke of a miraculous salvation, an experimental warp engine or localized anti-warp nullifier engineered by radical elements of the priesthood. Its theoretical purpose was as audacious as it was desperate. It was designed to emit an arcane frequency capable of severing the Tyranid hive mind from its endless biological swarms, effectively drowning out the encroaching shadow in the warp. Yet to reach into the abyss and weaponize its currents is a supreme folly that has doomed countless human worlds. The Imperium survives this horrific era of technological stagnation precisely because of its unyielding dogma. To innovate is to invite the attention of the ruinous powers. To tamper with forbidden xenotech and unhallowed warp machinery without the merciless puritanical oversight of the Inquisition is an absolute invitation to apocalyptic ruin. The Adeptus Mechanicus often forgets that the barrier between holy scientific enlightenment and catastrophic techno-heresy is thinner than a monomolecular blade. By seeking to outsmart the Great Devourer, the architects of Project Aurora had unwittingly offered themselves to a much older predator. The impossible crystalline formations sprouting from the slaughtered defenders proved that the Archmagos had not severed a psychic connection, but rather forged a terrifying new one. The suffocating psychic static of the Tyranid invasion, which had weighed so heavily upon the minds of the Adeptus Astartes since their arrival, suddenly began to fracture. The heavy, oppressive psychic silence of the Xenos mind was violently torn apart. Through that jagged, invisible tear in reality, bleeding out from the very walls of the defiled sanctum, came the sudden and piercing shrieks of chaos sorcery. The slaughter within the Mechanicus vaults was but a prelude to a far more insidious horror. Above the shattered manufactorums of Avarax, the ash-choked skies did not darken with the falling spores of the Great Devourer. Instead, the heavens tore open in a jagged wound of agonizing cerulean light. The cloying stench of alien ichor was instantly overpowered by the ozone reek of raw immaterium. From these weeping dimensional rifts marched the traitorous scions of Magnus the Red. The Thousand Suns had come. At the vanguard of this nightmare stood Sorcerer Lord Imura. Arrogant and steeped in forbidden arcana, he orchestrated the warp storm with the casual flick of a runic staff. He had not come to conquer the Tyranids, but to use their apocalyptic frenzy as a shield. While the Xenos swarms drowned the planetary defenders in blood, Imura reached his wretched claws toward the true prize of Avarax. He sought to claim the secrets of Project Aurora from the very facility the Ultramarines had bled to uncover. The battlefield that followed defied all sane comprehension. It was a terrifying juxtaposition of pure cosmic chaos and unnatural order. The Tyranid swarms thrashed in a blind, shrieking frenzy, their synaptic networks temporarily disrupted and confused by the vile phenomena of the warp. Around them, untouched by panic, marched the Rubric Marines. They advanced in perfect, terrifying synchronization. Not a single battlecry escaped their crested helms. Only the mechanical crunch of their boots and the relentless bark of their inferno bolters pierced the din of the Xenos horde. To witness the Rubric Marines is to look upon one of the greatest tragedies of the Horus heresy. 10 millennia ago, in a desperate bid to save his legion from catastrophic mutations of the flesh, Chief Librarian Ahriman cast a grand and terrible spell. The rubric of Ahriman cured the corruption, but the cost was an eternity of damnation. Every legionary lacking sufficient psychic prowess was reduced to a handful of dust, their physical forms incinerated while their spirits remained eternally trapped within their armor. Their bodies were reduced to nothing but ash, their tormented souls forever sealed within their ornate, hermetically locked armor. Now they are nothing more than mindless automatons. They are dust and echoes, condemned to march in eerie silence, acting only upon the telepathic commands of the sorcerers who survived the curse. For Lieutenant Titus, the sight of these cerulean traitors ripped open old psychological wounds. Flashes of his grueling battle against the forces of chaos on the forge world of Graia flooded his mind. Once again he was trapped in the agonizing vice of a war on two fronts. He faced the infinite consuming hunger of the Xenos on one side and the malevolent reality-warping malice of the arch-enemy on the other. The tactical nightmare was absolute, threatening to crush his squad beneath the weight of two apocalyptic forces. No mere strike team could weather such an impossibly layered catastrophe alone. Recognizing the scale of the devastation, Titus activated his Vox link to transmit a desperate, encrypted plea into the void. It was a call to high command, reaching out to awaken the grand strategic might of Marneus Calgar and the chapter itself. Beyond the warp-stained skies of Avarax, the true scale of the nightmare unfolds across the 500 worlds of Ultramar. Within the vaulted strategium of Macragge, the grand holographic war table burns with the light of a dozen dying systems. Crimson runes denoting the Great Devourer intertwine with the sickly purple luminescence of newly birthed warp storms. The Tyranid menace and the sorcerous legions of chaos do not merely threaten the borders of the realm, but strike deep into its very heart. Standing before this shimmering projection of galactic ruin is Marneus Calgar. The chapter master of the Ultramarines is a titan of stoic resolve, yet the burden of impossible choices weighs heavily upon his augmented shoulders. The logistical reality he faces is nothing short of an absolute impossibility. When the Primarch Guilliman launched the Indomitus crusade to reclaim a fractured galaxy, he drew heavily upon the reserves of his home sector. Now, the proud sons of Macragge are stretched perilously thin, scattered across countless war zones in a desperate bid to hold back the encroaching dark. To govern and protect this vast stellar empire, Guilliman resurrected the ancient system of the Tetrarchs. 4 seasoned commanders were given dominion over the distinct sectors of Ultramar, tasked with marshalling its immense resources and overseeing the Ultramar Auxilia. These planetary defense forces were once the envy of the Imperium, highly trained and superbly equipped. Yet against the relentless compounding horrors of a two-front war, they are being consumed wholesale. Millions of loyal soldiers are ground into dust each day, their lives spent buying mere hours of time against the endless swarms of Xenos biologies and the warp-forged abominations of the arch-enemy. Calgar watches the casualty feed cycle endlessly across his retinal displays. He knows the truth of Avarax. The revelation of the Thousand Suns transforms a planetary defense into an apocalyptic crucible that threatens to shatter the local subsector. Protocol and tactical doctrine demand the deployment of an entire company of Adeptus Astartes to purge such a profound sorcerous contagion. But the chapter master has no such company to give. To draw forces from the neighboring systems would invite total collapse across the northern marches of the Tetrarchy. The grand armies of the Imperium are tied down in 1,000 grueling meat grinders, leaving Calgar with only one viable strategy. He must rely on the precise surgical application of extreme violence. Instead of a legion, he will authorize a high-risk decapitation strike. A specialized kill team must pierce the heart of the enemy lines and sever the head of the serpent before its venom can spread. As the holographic projection of Avarax flares with malefic energy, Calgar finalizes his transmission, placing the entire burden of this desperate gambit squarely upon the broad shoulders of Demetrian Titus. To spearhead a counter-offensive against the traitorous sorcerers of the Thousand Suns is to invite the warp directly into your own mind. For Brother Chiron, the mere proximity of traitor legionaries does not just invite madness, it resurrects a ghost he has carried for 10 millennia. In the suffocating quiet of the staging bays, before the drop pods plummet into the atmosphere, the pristine armor of the Primaris hides a deeply fractured soul. To understand the burden Chiron bears is to understand the cruel miracle of the Primaris creation process. He is not a child born to the misery of this dark millennium. He is a survivor of Calth. Before his ascension, before the endless sleep, he was a mortal boy watching the word-bearers burn his vibrant world to toxic ash. Archmagos' call raised these warriors over 10,000 years of painstaking labor, culturing their gene seed in the deepest vaults beneath the red surface of Mars. Consider the unutterable psychological trauma of that awakening. You close your eyes to the slaughter of your family, the sky choked with radioactive fire and screaming demons, and you open them 10,000 years later. The secular truth of the Imperium you knew is dust. The emperor you revered as a leader is now worshipped as a silent, suffering god on a golden throne. Everyone you ever knew or loved has been dead for 100 centuries. Yet the exact same nightmare that destroyed your childhood is still tearing across the galaxy, entirely unpunished. For Chiron, the underworld war never truly ended. As he sits in the gloom of the armory, his legendary Astartes stoicism begins to crack under the weight of memory. The hyper-aggression implanted through his brutal neural conditioning surges uncontrollably to the surface. His augmented muscles spasm with the phantom echoes of ancient terrors. His breathing grows ragged and heavy, his armored grip on his bolt rifle tight enough to warp the adamantium casing. The hatred he harbors for the forces of chaos is not merely the righteous zeal of a space marine. It is a visceral, all-consuming agony that blinds his tactical judgment and demands immediate, bloody retribution. Lieutenant Titus watches this quiet disintegration from across the chamber with a heavy heart. Titus is a creature of cold, methodical discipline, a veteran who has stared into the absolute abyss of the warp and maintained his sanity through sheer force of will. He approaches his volatile brother, offering a low, grounding word of command, attempting to anchor Chiron to the present battlefield. Titus knows that rage can be a formidable weapon, but unrestrained hatred is a fatal vulnerability the arch-enemy will gladly exploit. He seeks to temper the roaring inferno of Chiron's grief into a focused, deliberate blade. But this raw display of psychological ruin does not go unnoticed in the quiet of the ship. From the shadows of the armory, Brother Gadriel silently observes the trembling hands of the Calth survivor and the quiet desperation in the voice of their lieutenant. A cold seed of suspicion firmly takes root in Gadriel's rigidly disciplined mind. If a warrior of Chiron's immense capability is this dangerously close to breaking, the stability of the entire squad is entirely compromised. The coming battle requires absolute perfection, but Gadriel now looks upon his brothers and sees only impending disaster. The lingering echo of Chiron's near-fatal lapse in discipline hangs heavy in the humid air of the strike cruiser. It is a raw nerve that leaves the squad primed for paranoia. Brother Gadriel watches Lieutenant Titus with eyes that do not see a savior, but a ticking cipher. Gadriel is a warrior forged in the uncompromising fires of Macragge, a true son of Guilliman who respects the undeniable, brutal efficiency of his commander's combat prowess. Yet his mind is poisoned by the relentless whispers that echo through the monolithic halls of the chapter monastery. These are the rumors born from the shadow of Leandros, tales of an Astartes who stood too close to the warping fires of the ruinous powers and somehow emerged unscathed. For an Ultramarine, the Codex Astartes is not merely a treatise on warfare. It is the absolute architecture of their reality, the holy law that binds their brotherhood together against the encroaching dark. Within such a rigid culture, any deviance is immediately viewed through the lens of heresy. To survive the touch of the warp without corruption defies the written tenets of their holy texts. It is an anomaly that demands an explanation, and in the paranoid ranks of the Imperium, anomaly is the vanguard of betrayal. This insidious doubt does not bloom in a vacuum. It is carefully cultivated by the unseen influence of the chapter chaplaincy. To understand the Adeptus Astartes is to understand that a chaplain is far more than a mere spiritual guide. They are the spiritual bedrock of the chapter, the grim wardens tasked with maintaining the psychological and ideological purity of the Battle Brothers. Clad in armor black as the void and wearing the visage of death, a chaplain monitors every confession, every hesitation, and every lingering glance. They are the wardens of the soul, ready to mete out the Emperor's peace to any warrior who exhibits the slightest symptom of warp contagion. It is their doctrine that has planted these deep seeds of suspicion within Gadriel, framing Titus's unnatural resistance to the warp not as a miracle, but as a latent curse waiting to detonate. Gadriel finds himself torn between the innate, sacred bond of Astartes' brotherhood and the suffocating weight of chapter dogma. Every command Titus issues is followed with flawless martial precision, yet every look Gadriel returns is laden with the unspoken threat of summary execution. He is a coiled spring, his hand hovering ever closer to the hilt of his blade, waiting for the singular misstep that will confirm the damning rumors. The squad is no longer just a weapon pointed at the enemy, but a fractured assembly of suspicious minds turned inward. This fragile psychological state could not come at a more perilous moment. The order for deployment chimes through the rusted vox emitters, calling the Astartes to the desolate graveyard world of Demetrium. They are descending into a realm steeped in ancient decay and shifting realities, a place where the barrier between the material universe and the immaterium grows perilously thin. On the scarred surface of Demetrium, the machinations of Tzeentchian sorcery wait to test the very fractures that now divide them. The transition from orbit to the surface of Demetrium is a plunge through sheer madness. Drop pods tear through an atmosphere that does not burn with friction, but bleeds with unnatural colors. The sky above the world is fractured like shattered glass, glowing with the diseased luminescence of an encroaching warp storm. As the strike force slams into the crust of the planet, the tension that has been quietly tearing the squad apart is instantly swallowed by the absolute oppressive silence of a dead world. They have made landfall deep behind enemy lines, utterly isolated within an expanse of hostile warp geometry and towering ancient tombs. This is Demetrium, the focal point of a grand and terrible design. It is a planet characterized by endless ash wastes and vast Gothic mausoleums that stretch from horizon to horizon in an unbroken sprawl of sorrow. Here, gargantuan statues of ancient imperial heroes stand vigil over the dust, their stone eyes weeping thick streams of dark, coagulated blood. To understand the true horror of the sorcerer Imura and his grand ritual, one must understand the grim nature of an imperial cemetery world. Across the galaxy, the Adeptus Ministorum designates certain planets solely for the veneration of the dead. These shrine worlds are transformed into planetary necropolises, their continents paved over with labyrinthine crypts, colossal ossuaries, and monuments to fallen billions. Every square mile is saturated with the grief of untold pilgrims, the final prayers of martyrs, and the lingering psychic echoes of souls transitioning into the immaterium. Over millennia, this staggering accumulation of death and reverence creates a localized resonance in the warp, a heavy psychic gravity born from countless generations of mourning. For a sorcerer of the Thousand Suns, this resonance is the ultimate prize. Imura does not merely see a graveyard, nor does he see a holy monument to the faithful. He sees a battery of incomprehensible scale. By tapping into the psychic weight of a billion graves, the sorcerer intends to siphon that ambient spiritual agony to power a colossal tear in reality. The very bones of the Emperor's faithful are being weaponized to fuel a catastrophic warp rift that will drown the sector in madness. Surrounded by the shifting esoteric architecture of the ruinous powers, the Space Marines push forward through the gloom. Every shadow in the necropolis seems to writhe with malicious, unseen intent. The silence of the dead is profound, yet the ash under their armored boots suddenly begins to tremble with a new, physical vibration. It is not the sorcery of the Thousand Suns that shakes the ground. A foul biological stench cuts through the dry, stagnant dust of the crypts. The skies above the shattered atmosphere darken once more, not with warp lightning, but with a sudden rain of fleshy, jagged spores. The great devourer was not left behind in the void. The Tyranids have followed the scent of prey down into the graveyard, drawn by the radiant psychic beacon of the dark ritual. Now the isolated strike force finds itself trapped among the tombs, caught between the arcane horrors of the warp and the ravenous hunger of an Xenos swarm. The graveyard world of Demetrium had become a crucible of unimaginable horrors. Titus and his warriors stepped into a war zone where the fundamental laws of reality were being violently rewritten. The Great Devourer does not merely consume, it learns. Faced with the warp-infused might of the Thousand Suns, the Hive fleet recognized that scything talons and crushing brute strength were profoundly inefficient against bolts of raw sorcery and traitor marines composed of nothing but animate dust. The swarm adapted with terrifying speed. Instead of unleashing endless tides of frenzied physical attackers, the organic bioships rained highly specialized terrors down upon the blackened earth. The bruised skies above the sprawling necropolis burned with ethereal fires as the Tyranids deployed their living psychic artillery. Vast cohorts of zoanthropes floated effortlessly over the shattered gravestones, their bloated and unnatural craniums pulsing with stolen atmospheric energy. Leading these floating broods were the neurothropes, apex conduits of unfathomable Xenos malice. They did not seek to tear the rubric marines apart in close quarters. Instead, they unleashed shrieking torrents of bioplasmic agony and focused psychic bombardments. Blinding arcs of devastating synaptic lightning tore through the rigid ranks of the Thousand Suns, obliterating ancient ceramite and violently scattering the cursed ashes sealed within. Yet the most devastating weapon of the Tyranids was not visible to the mortal eye. It was felt in the sudden, sickening pressure building within the minds of all who stood upon the blighted surface. The hive mind was actively projecting the horrific phenomenon known to Imperial scholars as the shadow in the warp. To understand this cosmic terror is to stare directly into the howling abyss of the Xenos soul. The Tyranid race operates through a synaptic network of countless billions of interconnected creatures, all constantly communicating across the cold void. This sheer astronomical volume of telepathic traffic creates a deafening, crushing static within the Imperium. It is a smothering shroud of white noise that drowns out the natural currents of the warp entirely. Human psychers exposed to this psychic roar are rapidly driven to catatonic madness, their fragile minds collapsing under the sheer weight of an eternal and ravenous hunger. Astropathic choirs bleed from their eyes as their celestial connections are brutally severed, and warp travel in the affected sector becomes a suicidal impossibility. On the cursed soil of Demerium, this suffocating psychic shroud was the very thing preventing absolute catastrophe. The vile sorcerer Imura had initiated a ritual of world-ending proportions, yet the cosmic static of the hive mind was violently choking his infernal incantations. The shadow in the warp acted as an invisible vice, crushing the chaotic energies Imura desperately tried to weave and keeping his apocalyptic rite from completing in a single ruinous heartbeat. The Thousand Suns were forced to expend vast reserves of their foul power just to push back against the crushing weight of the Tyranid collective consciousness. The traitors were fully consumed by this apocalyptic war of synaptic dominance against sorcerous supremacy. Through the choking dust and the crackling emerald fires, Titus saw the singular opportunity he had prayed to the God Emperor to find. With the arch-sorcerers entirely focused on surviving the relentless mental suppression of the Xenos swarm, the shadowed path to the inner sanctum was finally exposed. Leaving the slaughter of the Xenos and the Heretic behind, the squad crosses the threshold into the central mausoleum. But the Sanctuary of the Dead is no longer a monument to imperial glory. Imura has violated the stone, warping the grand cathedral into a nightmare of impossible geometry. The physical laws of the universe hold no dominion here. Gravity shifts with nauseating suddenness, dragging the Adeptus Astartes across vaulted ceilings and down obsidian stairwells that twist endlessly back upon themselves. Corridors stretch into oblivion, only to deposit the Space Marines exactly where they began. The faces of stone gargoyles animate and sneer, whispering blasphemous truths from the shadows. This is a domain forged from pure madness. It is a labyrinth born of Tzeentch. To comprehend this horror, one must understand the architect of fate. Tzeentch is the chaos god of change, of magic, and of convoluted paradoxical schemes that span entire millennia. The servants of the great conspirator do not wage war purely with bolter shells and roaring chainswords. Instead, they fight with deception and devastating illusion. They do not simply seek to butcher the flesh of their enemies, they seek to unravel the mind by exploiting a mortal soul's deepest, most tragic flaws. To fight a sorcerer of Tzeentch is to fight a war where your own thoughts are turned against you. Imra proves to be a dark master of this art. His voice ceases to be an echo in the physical corridors and instead becomes a serpent coiled tightly inside their minds. He speaks directly to the Space Marines, his telepathic whispers dripping with toxic salvation. He promises them the forbidden answers they have been denied. He offers them the power to smite their true enemies and the absolution they secretly crave in the dark. But Imra does not speak to them as a squad. He targets them as isolated, fractured individuals. The raw stuff of the Imperium bleeds through the cracks in the masonry, weaponizing their internal torment. For Chiron, the twisting walls begin to bleed with the burning ashes of Kalth. His legendary rage is violently amplified. His twin hearts beat a frantic rhythm of uncontrolled fury as the shadows morph into the ghosts of his slaughtered past, crying out to be avenged. For Gadriel, the labyrinth becomes a suffocating mirror of his own festering paranoia. Imra feeds the doubt that has been gnawing at Gadriel for days. The sorcerer weaves a brilliant tapestry of lies, whispering of hidden loyalties, concealed taint, and inevitable betrayal from within their own ranks. The psychic pressure mounts to an agonizing, crushing crescendo. The stone walls breathe, exhaling a palpable madness that overwhelms even their transhuman resilience. Reality splinters completely. Gadriel stares down the corridor and sees only treason where there is duty. The psychic poison of the enemy finally breaches the inner citadel of his sanity. Blinded by these carefully engineered delusions, drowning in an ocean of orchestrated distrust, Gadriel raises his weapon. The labyrinth has done its work. With a trembling hand and a mind poisoned by the changer of ways, Gadriel draws his power blade, stepping toward Lieutenant Titus with murderous intent. The labyrinth of madness crafted by the sorcerer Imra finally takes its toll. Gadriel stands at the precipice of damnation, his mind poisoned by warp-born phantoms and his own festering doubts. His gauntlet trembles as he raises his crackling blade, prepared to drive it directly into the chest of his commanding officer. The accusations tear from his throat, a litany of supposed betrayals and treasons laid at the feet of Demetrian Titus. Gadriel believes with every fibre of his being that Titus has led them into a snare of his own design. The chamber echoes with the devastating sound of a space marine prepared to execute his own brother. In the face of this ultimate betrayal, Titus is forced to block the sudden violent strike, their weapons locking in a shower of sparks, an anchor of absolute resolve in a sea of sorcerous deceit. He meets the terrified, rage-filled eyes of Gadriel with a gaze of unyielding adamantine. Titus strips away the rank, the suspicion, and the warp-spawned lies, projecting only the pure authority of a true leader. He commands his brother to see through the veil of Imura's deceptions. He offers no defense against the mad accusations, but rather an absolute refusal to let a son of Guilliman fall to the arch-enemy's psychological torment. To witness the Adeptus Astartes turn their wrath upon one another is to stare into the darkest abyss of Imperial history. It is a trauma that resonates backward through 10 millennia of bloodshed, echoing the ultimate tragedy of the Horus heresy. When brother fights brother, the foundational mythos of the Imperium bleeds. The Ultramarines are particularly vulnerable to this specific breed of ideological subversion. Their rigid adherence to the Codex Astartes structures their very thoughts, creating a paradigm where any deviation from doctrine is immediately suspected as heresy. Imra weaponized this dogmatic purity, twisting Gadriel's righteous devotion to the rules into a paralyzing paranoia. When the law of the Codex becomes a cage, even the most loyal warrior can be convinced that his commander is an agent of chaos. Yet the will of Titus proves stronger than the insidious whispers of the warp. With words forged in the fires of shared sacrifice, he reminds Gadriel of their true enemy. He does not demand obedience through the threat of violence, but through the unbreakable bond of their shared gene seed. Slowly, agonizingly, the illusions shatter against the immovable bulwark of Titus's faith. The trembling bolter is lowered. The madness drains from Gadriel's eyes, replaced first by horror at what he nearly did, and then by a cold, righteous fury directed at the sorcerer who manipulated him. In this crucible of near betrayal, the last remnants of doubt are burned away entirely. A new and unshakable trust is forged between the brothers, cementing a unity of purpose that nothing in the Imperium can break as they turn their collective wrath toward the heart of the labyrinth. Titus, Chiron, and Gadriel stand united at last, their brotherhood forged anew in the fires of mutual trust, yet they find themselves staring into the maw of an unavoidable doom. An endless, silent phalanx of thousand suns marches forward, a relentless tide of warp-born sorcery preparing to drown the small squad of Ultramarines. But just as the suffocating weight of the arch-enemy threatens to extinguish their defiance, the very heavens unleash their judgment. The ash-choked sky above the necropolis is obliterated by a blinding detonation of displaced atmosphere and contrails of fire. Plummeting into the sprawling ruins like meteors forged of pure wrath are the drop pods of the Ultramarines. The Chapter Master has chosen a direct orbital assault, driving his pod directly into the black heart of the enemy lines. His impact is a cataclysm of kinetic devastation. Before the swirling debris can even settle, the Lord of Macragge becomes a blur of brutal, sweeping violence. He crashes into the immobile ranks of the Rubric Marines, wielding the gauntlets of Ultramar with the fury of a dying sun. His every blow carries enough concussive force to rupture battle tanks. Traitor armor that has survived 10,000 years of continuous warfare is pulverized in a single strike, the ancient dust of the legionaries exploding outward into the ash-choked air. Volleys of mass-reactive rounds roar from his integrated weapons, detonating point-blank to tear through the sorcerous constructs with unrelenting hostility. To understand the violence wrought by his hands is to understand the legacy of the relics he bears. The gauntlets of Ultramar are artifacts of unimaginable antiquity, irreplaceable treasures of the chapter that date back to an era of myth and ruin. Chroniclers whisper that these colossal power fists were wrested from a defeated Chaos champion by the Primarch Guilliman during the darkest hours of the galaxy, claimed as a prize of war and repurposed for righteous vengeance. To witness Marneus Calgar wielding such apocalyptic history upon the battlefield is to look upon a demigod stepping forth from the stained glass windows of an imperial cathedral. His physical presence anchors the very reality of the war zone. For Titus and his embattled brothers, the arrival of their liege lord is a benediction of supreme tactical dominance. The crushing fatigue of the long campaign evaporates instantly. They rally behind the colossal, ceramite-clad bulk of their chapter master, their bolters singing in perfect synchronized harmony. With the front line now entirely commanded by a living titan of war, the tactical paradigm of the battle shifts instantly. Calgar does not merely fight, but orchestrates the slaughter of his foes with cold, imperial precision. Striding through a storm of incoming inferno bolts that spark harmlessly against his immense armor, he turns his scarred visage toward Titus. The chapter master claims the absolute vanguard, drawing the limitless fury of the thousand suns entirely upon himself. He issues a singular, unbroken mandate to the lieutenant. Titus is ordered to take his squad, bypass the immediate slaughter, and sever the throat of the demonic invasion. They must advance through the ruins to destroy the shrieking Helldrake and the cursed obelisks that keep the warp rift torn open in the sky above. Though the wrath of Marneus Calgar had broken the traitor lines upon the ground, the poisoned heavens of Demetrium offered no such reprieve. A shadow darker than the ash wastes swept over the battlefield, preceded by a metallic screech that shattered glass and ruptured eardrums. It was a Helldrake, an apex predator of the ruined skies. This mechanical monstrosity was a profane fusion of demonic flesh and supersonic fighter craft, a nightmare forged in the deepest abysses of the Eye of Terror. Its wings beat with thunderous force, raining down torrents of iridescent warp fire. Whatever this cursed flame touched did not merely burn, it mutated. Plasteel bubbled and grew weeping eyes, while stone twisted into screaming, blistered flesh. To understand the horror of the Helldrake is to understand the darkest sins of the traitor legions. In the sprawling hellforges of the Warp, the heretics of the Dark Mechanicum practice arts too vile to name. They do not merely build machines of war. Through blasphemous rituals, they drag screaming entities from the Imperium and bind them into shells of cold iron, adamantium, and brass. These are the demon engines, weapons that possess a predatory malice and a terrible, endless capacity to feel pain. Driven completely mad by their imprisonment within real space, these tortured entities lash out at all life, turning their eternal agony into an engine of absolute destruction. The Helldrake that circled above the Ultramarines was just such a creature, hunting with the cunning of an ancient fiend and the blistering velocity of a strike fighter. The Adeptus Astartes are the ultimate infantrymen, but fighting a supersonic demon engine from the ground presents an agonizing tactical challenge. Standard bolter fire simply ricocheted off its brass-wrought scales, raining harmlessly into the ash below. The squad was forced to rely on raw ingenuity and the absolute devastation of their heaviest munitions. As the beast dove for another sweeping strafing run, drenching the ruins with its mutating breath, the Space Marines sprang a desperate trap. Channeling their righteous fury, the Space Marines poured relentless, concentrated bolter and plasma fire directly into the beast's articulated joints and glowing visual sensors, denying it the skies. The sudden violent drag forced the Helldrake off its flight path, its metallic shrieks echoing in boundless fury across the desolate plains. Using the momentum of the screaming machine against it, the Space Marines turned their focus to the decaying structures immediately ahead of the beast. Volley after volley of mass-reactive rounds slammed into the demon engine until its armor was breached. The Helldrake plummeted with the force of a falling star, crashing violently into the ruins below, its metallic wings snapping and its demonic heart stuttering as it retreated from the overwhelming firepower. A final, pitiful screech bled from its metallic maw before its furnace fires died entirely. With the burning carcass of the demon engine silenced, the skies above Demetrian finally cleared. Through the parting ash and smoke, the squad looked out across the blasted wasteland and beheld the true purpose behind the heretic ritual, a sprawling ring of jagged obsidian structures piercing the bruised horizon, the ominous and terrible geometry of the Noctilith crowns. The sky of Demetrian tore open not with the weeping saws of the Warp, but with the righteous fury of Macragge. Drop pods slammed into the graveyard world like the hammers of the Emperor himself. Above them, the brass and bone monstrosity of a Chaos Helldrake unleashed a warp-shrieking cacophony that sought to shatter the mind. Yet this chaotic chorus was instantly drowned out by the measured, overwhelming thunder of absolute discipline. The ramp of the central pod crashed down, and forth stepped Marneus Calgar, chapter master of the Ultramarines, flanked by the unyielding bulwark of his Victrix honor guard. For Demetrian Titus, the arrival was a salvation forged in ceramite, but for Gadriel and Chiron, it was a profound genetic realignment. To witness a chapter master take to the field is to experience a fundamental override of the Adeptus Astartes biology. Every lingering seed of doubt, every fracture of mistrust bred by the taint of this cursed world, was instantly eradicated. The presence of the genetic liege acts as a supreme psychological imperative, binding the shattered fragments of a squad into a singular, perfectly synchronized instrument of war. Beneath Calgar's gaze, the Space Marines ceased to be individuals wrestling with suspicion. They became the pristine edge of the gladius, their bolter drill falling into a flawless rhythm that mocked the anarchic screams of the demon engine above. Marneus Calgar did not merely command the battlefield, he broke it over his knee. Upon his fists rested the gauntlets of Ultramar, relics of incalculable antiquity reclaimed from the body of a fallen champion millennia ago. These master-crafted weapons are the physical manifestation of the chapter's indomitable will. With every swinging arc, the gauntlets reduced the twisted armor of Thousand Suns rubric marines to glittering dust. When a tide of Tyranid horrors surged forward in mindless hunger, the underslung bolters roared, obliterating chitin and flesh with mass reactive devastation. The ancient power fields sheathing the adamantium fists punched through the heaviest battleplate as if it were parchment. Calgar fought not with the feral desperation of a lesser warrior, but with the cold, imperial majesty of a sovereign executing a traitor. The graveyard world quaked beneath the unrelenting advance of the Victrix Honor Guard, their crackling blades weaving a flawless defensive perimeter around their liege lord. Inspired by this absolute martial dominance, Titus leveled his own weapon. The bonds of brotherhood with Gadriel and Chiron reforged in the fires of absolute awe. The landing zone was scoured clean of the Xenos and the Heretic alike. There was no longer room for hesitation, nor for the insidious whispers of discord. United under the towering silhouette of Marneus Calgar, the Ultramarines turned their visors toward the true heart of the corruption. A path of shattered corpses had been carved through the slaughter, leading directly to the jagged spires of Imura's stronghold. With the chapter master holding the landing zone in a grip of iron, Titus and his veterans became the unyielding tip of the spear. They drove deep into the shadow of Imura's ritual site, a colossal megalith of forgotten Xenos genesis. Once this obsidian monolith might have been a dormant tomb of living metal or a monument to dead Xenos gods, but the touch of the Changer of Ways had twisted it into an altar of pure madness. As the Space Marines advanced, the fundamental laws of reality began to unravel around them. Non-Euclidean geometry bled into the physical realm, turning the landscape into a sickening labyrinth of impossible angles, inverted spires, and infinite stairways. Gravity lost its certain hold, shifting without warning and forcing the Astartes to fight while anchored to slanted ruins that defied the horizon. Even the ambient light was corrupted, fracturing into prismatic colors that burned the retina and cast elongated shadows that moved independently of their casters. Entrenched within this mind-bending architecture were the defensive lines of the Thousand Suns. From the shifting barricades, the rubric marines unleashed overlapping storms of warp flame from their ornate inferno bolters. These were no ordinary traitors, but the Dust Brethren, the tragic victims of the rubric of Ahriman. 10 millennia ago, in a desperate bid to save his legion from ravenous mutation, the chief librarian Ahriman cast a spell of unimaginable power. The sorcery succeeded in halting the rampant flesh change, but the price was absolute damnation. Those without potent psychic ability were reduced to ash, their souls bound forever within the ceramite shells of their own power armor. Titus was not fighting living, breathing warriors, but hollow automatons driven only by the echoes of ancient betrayal and the dark will of their sorcerous masters. When a blessed bolter shell cracked their azure plating, no blood spilled upon the fractured earth. Instead, a dry cascade of pale dust poured from the wounds, blowing away on the unnatural winds of the warp. Yet in battle, these empty suits of armor were terrifyingly relentless. They marched in perfect emotionless synchronicity, unaffected by pain, fear, or the breaking of reality around them. They existed only to unleash torrents of etheric warp flame that could melt through loyalist armor and instantly scorch the flesh beneath. The advance transformed into a grueling theater of brutal close-quarters trench fighting. Every single yard gained was bought with extreme prejudice, as the Ultramarines pushed through corridors filled with swirling warp fire and the silent, marching dead of the 15th Legion. Chainswords roared against ancient adamantium, and the heavy thud of bolt rifles answered the shrieking fusillades of sorcerous energy. Titus led from the front, his righteous fury serving as a beacon against the encroaching insanity. Through sheer, indomitable will, the squad smashed through the final layers of the defensive perimeter. They weathered the unnatural firestorms and the psychic static that threatened to tear their very minds asunder. Before them loomed the immense cyclopean gates of the outer sanctum, standing as the threshold between the madness of the trenches and the absolute heart of the heresy. With a thunderous roar of explosives, the ancient bulkhead was torn apart, spilling the unnatural light of the central chamber outward into the gloom. Deep within the non-Euclidean geometries of the central ritual chamber, the grim climax of Project Aurora is finally realized. Imura stands triumphant, raising the stolen Adeptus Mechanicus artifact above his head. Its captured machine spirits scream in digital agony as foul sorcery corrupts their holy logic engines. With a single devastating invocation, the traitor plunges the relic into the unseen fabric of reality. The immaterium shatters like brittle glass. The Aurora Rift is born, a violent laceration in the physical universe that vomits the raw, kaleidoscopic energies of the Imperium directly onto the battered crust of Demetrian. Here, the true horror of the cosmos is laid bare as two utterly incompatible manifestations of psychic supremacy collide. The Tyranid swarm, unified by the oppressive, suffocating weight of the shadow in the warp, meets the unbridled anarchy of the immaterium. The hive mind projects an endless psychic static, a suffocating null void of biological hunger meant to smother all warpcraft. But the rift is a geyser of pure, unrestrained impossibility, defying the cold laws of physics and biology alike. As the chaotic tides of the warp crash against the oppressive shadow of the Great Devourer, the resulting psychic feedback is nothing short of catastrophic. The minds of lesser bioforms are instantly overloaded by this impossible paradox. Hormagaunts and termagants spasm uncontrollably across the ritual chamber, their synaptic pathways burning out in flashes of psychic fire. Xenos craniums rupture in horrific showers of acidic ichor as the localized hive synapse frays and snaps. Even the colossal beast constructs roar in unprecedented agony, their biological circuitry melting under a terror their genetic programming cannot comprehend. Reveling in this maelstrom of Xenos suffering, Imura channels the psychic death throes of a billion organisms to fuel his ultimate blasphemy. From the bleeding, jagged edges of the newly formed rift, a gargantuan horror violently pulls itself into the physical realm. A lord of change, a greater demon of Tzeentch, manifests upon the profane ground, its massive avian form coalescing from the very friction of two cosmic apex predators tearing at each other. The central chamber instantly devolves into an apocalyptic triad of annihilation. It is a terrifying three-way war, where the cold, calculating logic of imperial machinery is crushed between the mindless, biological hunger of the Xenos swarm and the reality-warping madness of the demon. Vicious lightning storms of warp fire ignite the atmosphere, vaporizing chitin, steel, and ceramite alike. Within the epicenter of this reality-collapsing event, the ground dissolves into a nightmare of twisting flesh and weeping stone. Yet amidst this storm of unmaking, the sons of Macragge refuse to yield. Battered by gale-force winds of psychic mutation and deafened by the dying shrieks of the severed Tyranid swarm, Titus, Gadriel, and Chiron lock their boots to the trembling deck. They raise their bolters against the tempest of impossibility. With the rift widening above them and reality crumbling at their feet, the three Ultramarines step into the psychic hurricane, beginning their agonizing march forward to strike down Imura. From the bleeding wound in reality, the meat grinder of the lower terraces had offered only madness, but from that crucible of warp-spawned chaos emerged a trinity of unbroken resolve. The ascent up the central spire was a gauntlet of nightmares, yet Titus, Gadriel, and Chiron no longer fought as desperate individuals. The shadows of suspicion and the venom of doubt had been burned away in the fires of survival. Now they moved as an apex predator of three minds, executing the flawless, hyper-lethal geometry of the Adeptus Astartes. They engaged in a textbook Gladius Strike, a maneuver of overlapping fields of fire and interlocking defences that turned the steep stairs into a slaughterhouse for the Neverborn. Titus formed the spearhead, his chainsword roaring in a relentless arc, while his flanks were secured by an impenetrable bulwark of brotherly devotion. To his left, Gadriel was a tempest of disciplined blade work. With sweeping, masterful strikes, his power sword cleaved the air, deflecting the screaming warp blasts of demonic entities as if they were nothing more than bothersome insects. To his right, Chiron anchored the formation. The heavy bolter in his grip kicked with thunderous recoil, yet his stance was utterly immovable. The furious rage that had once threatened to consume his soul was now a cold, calculating precision, completely mastering his rage to transform wrath into perfectly placed mass-reactive detonations that shredded monstrous flesh to bloody mist. It is here that the mortal mind fails to comprehend the true nature of the Adeptus Astartes. To call them soldiers or even comrades is a profound disservice to the sacred alchemy of the Emperor. They are battle brothers, a designation that transcends mere human camaraderie. Bound by the same psycho-indoctrination and the shared genetic legacy of their Primarch, they possess a subliminal, almost psychic linkage on the battlefield. Heartbeats synchronize, breathing aligns. Without a single spoken word, they anticipate each strike, each reload, each pivot, functioning as a singular organism of war engineered solely for the annihilation of the enemies of mankind. Through the blood of Guilliman, they share a communion of violence that no demonic terror can fracture. This unbreakable synergy propelled them upward through the demon-haunted ascent. Malefic horrors poured down the spiraling architecture, a tidal wave of horns, claws, and warp fire seeking to drown the three Ultramarines. Yet the Triad advanced step by bloody step, a relentless engine of destruction that refused to yield a single inch of ground. Bolter casings cascaded down the stone steps like rain, ringing out a percussive hymn of vengeance. Together they shattered the final barricade of warped flesh and mutated armor, leaving nothing but ruin in their wake. The endless screaming of the horde gave way to the unnatural humming silence of the spire summit. The storm of battle parted around them as the last infernal defender crumbled to ash. There, standing alone amidst the swirling esoteric energies of the ritual chamber, the architect of this atrocity awaited. Titus stepped ahead of his brothers, his weapon revving as his eyes locked upon the levitating form of the Sorcerer Lord. Beyond the secured perimeter, at the absolute apex of the megalith, Lieutenant Titus stepped into the eye of the storm to face the architect of this nightmare. Sorcerer Lord Imura awaited him, suspended in the crackling energies of the Imperium. To duel a master of the Thousand Suns is to fight on two fronts simultaneously. It is a battle of flesh and a war of the soul. Imura did not merely strike with crackling warp fire and the bladed edge of his force staff. He struck directly at the mind of the Ultramarine. For a non-psyker, enduring such an assault is akin to standing crushed beneath the tread of a titan. The psychic pressure is absolute, tearing at the synapses and forcing blood from the eyes and ears. Every swing of Titus's chainsword required an ocean of willpower just to command his own muscles to move against the suffocating dread. Sparks rained down as adamantium teeth ground uselessly against Imura's telekinetic shielding, a barrier of pure malice that rejected the physical laws of reality. Imura did not need to speak aloud to be heard. His voice coiled inside the skull of the Space Marine like a venomous serpent. The sorcerer sought to shatter the warrior's resolve before he stopped his heart. Through telepathic intrusion, Imura exhumed the darkest ghosts of Titus's past. He whispered of Graia, of the bitter sting of Leandros, and his unforgivable betrayal. The sorcerer projected the cold, sterile chains of the Inquisition, making Titus feel the phantom ache of decades spent under the interrogator's blade. He mocked the endless, unheralded centuries in the Deathwatch, fighting as a Blackshield in exile, forgotten by the very chapter he had bled to save. Imura wove these traumas into a psychic spear, intent on cracking the indomitable foundation of the Space Marine. Yet the mind of Lieutenant Titus is a fortress that denies all logic of the warp. He is no pariah, no soulless blank walking the physical realm, but his spirit possesses an unnatural, gravity-like density. His soul is anchored entirely by duty, forged in an absolute, unyielding loyalty to the Emperor and the Primarch. The sorcerer's barbs found no purchase in a heart that had already forgiven its own suffering. Titus blinked away the blood weeping from his tear ducts and pushed forward, his boots cracking the obsidian floor. The warp-infused taunts of Imura turned from arrogant amusement to rising frustration, as the psychic spears shattered against an invisible shield of pure, stubborn conviction. Every ounce of the sorcerer's immense power was concentrated on maintaining his kinetic wards and breaking the mind of his adversary. Imura was a conduit, a vessel overflowing with the stolen energies of the rift. Titus parried a blinding arc of warp lightning, his armor scorching, his gen-enhanced physiology screaming under the unnatural strain. In that moment of burning clarity, the Ultramarine recognized the futility of striking at the master of the ritual while he was steeped in limitless power. Since his mind could not be broken, and the sorcerer's shields could not be pierced, the battle could not be won by the blade alone. Titus turned his bleeding gaze away from the laughing heretic, his tactical genius locking onto the pulsing heart of the machinery that anchored the ritual to real space. Through the howling tempest of Imura's psychic wrath, Titus lunges for the pulsating heart of the nightmare. He casts aside his weapons, reaching out with armored hands to physically grasp the corrupted core of Project Aurora. The moment his gauntlets make contact with the profane artifact, the physical toll is instantaneous and horrific. Ceramite, forged to withstand the fury of a dying star, begins to slag and run like weeping wax. The unadulterated warp energy radiating from the core is anathema to reality itself. It seeks to unmake him, pouring raw, screaming chaos directly into his flesh and soul. Beneath the melting armor, the skin of the Prima Res lieutenant blisters and chars to the bone. A lesser space marine, let alone a mortal man, would have been instantly dissolved, their biological matter mutated into groveling warp spawn or disintegrated into atmospheric ash. Yet Demetrian Titus is no ordinary Adeptus Astartes. Within his janicrafted blood lies a unique, inexplicable resilience to the maddening touch of the Imperium. This latent warding shields his soul just enough to anchor his dissolving physical form against the storm. Agony beyond mortal comprehension floods his nervous system, but his iron will holds absolute. With a roar that defies the laughing gods of the Empyrean, Titus exerts the absolute apex of his transhuman strength. He crushes the crystalline matrix of the Aurora core in his burning hands. The artifact shatters into corrupted dust. Reality shudders as a catastrophic implosion echoes across the battlefield. Instead of an outward detonation, a violently sudden vacuum of warp energy rips through the material plane. The tear in the veil collapses inward upon itself, dragging the unnatural storm down with it. Every demon summoned by the corrupted Mechanicus device is caught in this psychic riptide. Their arrogant laughter turns into shrieks of terror as they are violently dragged back into the abyss. Imura, the architect of this grand heresy, is caught at the epicenter of the arcane backlash. The sorcerous energies that fueled his unnatural vitality brutally reverse their flow. The Chaos Sorcerer screams a final pathetic curse before his armor collapses inward. His flesh and bone crumble instantly to grey dust, his essence violently banished to the darkest depths of the warp. The resulting shockwave of displaced reality hits Titus with the force of a falling drop pod. The Space Marine is thrown violently backward, his ruined armor trailing smoke as he crashes heavily into the shattered earth. He lies there, his bones broken and his physiology pushed past the absolute limits of destruction, having achieved the impossible once again. Above him, the malignant skies tear themselves closed. The great warp rift snaps shut with a deafening thunderclap that reverberates deep within the soul. Then, a heavy, eerie silence descends upon the scarred crust of the planet. The psychic screaming fades completely away, leaving only the mundane howl of the wind passing over fields of the dead. Titus does not move, his twin hearts beating a ragged rhythm in his chest. The surviving Imperial forces and the endless swarms of the Tyranid hive mind are suddenly left alone in the quiet devastation, separated only by the settling ash of a closed reality. The poisoned skies of Demerium finally cleared as the unnatural energies of the warp bled away into nothingness. Demonic ashes drifted upon the cold wind, settling over the shattered remains of the Thousand Suns. Amidst the ruins stood the battered remnants of his squad, and at their centre lay Demetrian Titus, exhausted and broken by the cataclysmic forces he had just unleashed. He had shattered the profane artifact, sealed the rift, and bought the system its salvation with his own blood. Yet in the grim darkness of the far future, survival is often rewarded only with suspicion. Before the dust could fully settle, the skull-masked visage of a chapter chaplain descended upon the scene like a vulture upon a corpse. It was Leandros, his former battle brother, who had seen the raw tides of the Imperium wash over the lieutenant, and whose paranoid mind demanded to know how any soul could endure such direct exposure to the warp and remain untainted. He approached with catechisms of suspicion, fully intending to drag Titus back into the shadows of interrogation. But their path was blocked by a wall of cerulean ceramite. Marneus Calgar, chapter master of the Ultramarines, stepped forward. His immense form cast a long shadow, and his voice struck with the force of a thunderhammer. He drew a definitive line, declaring before God Emperor and Primarch that the chapter trusted Titus. Here we must pause to understand the fragile political reality of the Imperium. On parchment, the holy orders of the Inquisition wield limitless authority, possessing the right to execute planetary governors and decree exterminatus without hesitation. However, this absolute power meets a terrifying immovable object when it encounters the Adeptus Astartes, particularly those of the first founding. The Ultramarines are the direct, unbroken legacy of Primarch Guilliman. To accuse one of their veteran officers, especially one who has shed oceans of blood for the Emperor, is a dangerous game. To do so while defying the direct word of Marneus Calgar, the chosen regent of a living Primarch, borders on suicidal arrogance. Even the most zealous lords of the Ordo Hereticus and Ordo Malleus know that forcing the issue could spark a catastrophic schism. The chaplain weighed his dogmatic zeal against the absolute command of Lord Macragge, and zeal lost. Leandros stepped back, his accusations breaking against the unyielding authority of his chapter master. For the first time in over a century, the name of Demetrian Titus was completely and unequivocally cleared. The burden of suspicion that had haunted his every waking breath was finally lifted, banished alongside the sorcerers of Prospero. He was an ultramarine, recognized in both deed and soul as a true son of Guilliman. Yet there was no time for celebration, nor any moment for rest. With the veil of reality restored and the forces of chaos denied their prize, the blinding glare of the cosmic war shifted back to its grim center. The system was no longer drowning in warp fire, but it was still choking on a nightmare of flesh and chitin. Beyond the atmosphere of Demerium, the void was still teeming with the great devourer. The Tyranid swarm continued its relentless consumption, completely uncaring of the demonic defeat, driven only by an endless and ravenous hunger. The treacherous energies of the Imperium bled away from the physical realm. With the abyssal rift sealed and the architect of their spiritual ruin banished, a suffocating silence fell over the contested systems. Yet this quiet was not a herald of salvation, but the drawing of a monolithic breath. The localized warp storms that had severed the Xenos' broods from their cosmic tether dissipated into nothingness. In that instant, the feral madness that had gripped the Tyranid swarms vanished entirely. The chaotic spasms of instinctual survival ceased. Across the battlefields of Demerium, Kadaku, and Avarax, billions of shrieking bioforms froze in absolute, unnatural unison. The shadow in the warp snapped back over the stars like a closing shroud. The synapse network, a psychic web of iron and frost, reasserted its absolute dominion over the lesser organisms. Where moments before there had been a fragmented horde of mindless beasts tearing at the fading remnants of demonic incursions, there was now only a singular, fathomless intellect. The hive mind had returned. It looked upon the ashes of the chaos assault with cold, calculating indifference. To the great devourer, the forces of the dark gods were but a foul, inedible anomaly. With the immaterial threat excised, the great eye of the Leviathan turned its terrible, unblinking gaze back upon the material harvest. There was no hesitation in this pivot, no delay for reorganization. The transition from fighting the ephemeral horrors of the warp to resuming the slaughter of Imperial defenders was a seamless, terrifying evolution. Bio-titans that had been engaged in clumsy, rage-fueled brawls with greater demons suddenly shifted their colossal weight, executing flawless tactical maneuvers to crush entrenched Astra Militarum armored divisions. Lictors melted back into the shadows of ruined hives, abandoning meaningless duels with cultists to orchestrate the decapitation of Imperial command structures. The chaotic frenzy was replaced by a grim, methodical efficiency that chilled the blood of every surviving loyalist. The men and women of the Imperium realized with dawning horror that their victory over chaos had brought them no reprieve. It was merely a prelude to the true nightmare. This was the pure war, a relentless grinding conflict of biological attrition devoid of spite, hatred, or malice. The Tyranids did not seek conquest or the corruption of souls. They sought only biomass. Every drop of blood spilled, every corpse left upon the scorched earth of the Residious system was nothing but fuel for the encroaching apocalypse. The defenders braced themselves against fortifications that were already crumbling, staring into a tidal wave of chitin and scythes that now moved with the terrifying precision of a single mind. Against such flawless synchronization, individual heroism would no longer suffice to hold the line. The isolated victories won by Bolt and Chainsword had secured a vital foothold, but the localized defense was rapidly collapsing under the sheer mathematical weight of the swarm. To combat this newly unified Tyranid front, the Imperium required a theater-wide orchestration of its own. The survival of the entire sector now depended on a grand strategy woven far beyond the blood-soaked trenches of Demetrian. The heavy burden of this monumental defense was already shifting outward, drawn across the stars to the sapphire jewel of the realm, where the master logisticians of the Ultramarines prepared to direct the tempest from the fortress of Macragge. As the warp rift sealed shut, the disparate biological horrors coalesced into a singular unified instrument of annihilation. This sudden and terrifying reorganization of the Xenos swarm did not go unnoticed by the supreme architect of the Imperial defense. Far from the blood-soaked trenches of the Demetrian system, the Lord Commander Primarch Guilliman stands over an astropathic chessboard spanning the entire galaxy. Demetrian is not a solitary tragedy, but a single agonizing data point within the incomprehensible scope of the Indomitus crusade. The avenging sun bears the crushing weight of a war fought on a million fronts. His transhuman mind must process the slow strangulation of the Imperium Nihilus alongside the creeping dread of the pariah nexus. Within the Nephilim sector, the insidious null field of the Necrons already stifles the warp and suffocates the souls of humanity. Guilliman is forced to fight an existential terror in one quadrant, while the greatest biological threat in galactic history devours the West. There can be no glorious reinforcement for every besieged world. The Fourth Tyrannic War has forced the Primarch to adopt a doctrine of strategic attrition. It is a cold, merciless calculus born of absolute necessity. Guilliman knows that to save the beating heart of the Imperium, the extremities must be allowed to rot. Outer systems, once vibrant jewels of the Emperor's realm, are now consciously designated as sacrificial offerings. Whole planetary sectors are transformed into elaborate speed bumps to stall the vast, encroaching western tendrils of Hive Fleet Leviathan. The demigod sits in his strategium and calculates the exact price of survival in oceans of human blood. He knows precisely how many regiments of the Astra Militarum must be ground into dust to delay the swarm by a single sidereal month. He measures the sacrifice of noble Adeptus Astartes chapters not in tears, but in the precious hours their agonizing deaths will buy for the fortification of core worlds. To the men and women dying in the mud of Demerium, the war is a terrifying chaos of snapping jaws and rending scythes. To Guilliman, it is a ledger of necessary planetary slaughter. Every lost hive city is a measured concession. Every annihilated fortress is a tactical pruning of a dying branch. This is the true horror of the 41st millennium, where entire systems are pushed off the galactic map by a singular stroke of the Primarch's pen. The sheer, unimaginable scale of this theatre reduces billions of screaming souls to simple friction against the Tyranid advance. Yet this grim sacrifice is the only logic that can preserve the fragile remnants of his father's empire. The Lord Commander absorbs the sickening mathematics of his overarching strategy and turns his heavy gaze toward the spiritual sanctuary of his own home. This doctrine of calculated ruin must now be codified and enforced. The grim harvest of time purchased by the dead of Demerium is about to manifest in brutal new defensive edicts for the 500 worlds of Ultramar. To ensure the core remained unbroken, the Macragge directive was enacted across the 500 worlds. The staggering military apparatus of Ultramar awoke to a war footing unseen since the dark days of the Horus Heresy. Billions of mortal men and women within the Ultramar Auxilia marched into the mud and rockcrete of their homeworlds, ordered to dig in and prepare for apocalyptic sieges. Above these endless trench lines, the skies burned with the cold light of plasma batteries as planetary defense grids and orbital fortresses were brought to maximum readiness. Void shields overlapped in shimmering domes of hard light, turning entire continents into impenetrable fortresses. It is here that one must understand the true, formidable nature of the realm of Ultramar. Across the wider galaxy, the Imperium of Man is a decaying monolith, rotting beneath the weight of bureaucratic inertia, religious fanaticism, and technological stagnation. Ultramar is the grand, shining exception to this tragic decline. It is a stellar empire of unmatched organization, staggering wealth, and rigorous military efficiency. Every citizen is a soldier in waiting, and every manufactorum operates with flawless, brutal precision. Because of this unwavering discipline, the 500 worlds remain the only human domain capable of enduring a direct, sustained Tyranid invasion of such catastrophic magnitude. Where a lesser sector would collapse into screaming anarchy upon the arrival of the terrifying shadow in the warp, Ultramar stood resolute against the creeping dark. Yet walls of reinforced ferrous steel and lines of fragile mortal flesh alone cannot halt the endless hunger of the great devourer. The tactical genius of the Primarch demanded the perfect integration of his newly forged Adeptus Astartes to break the endless tides of chitin. While the countless regiments of the Auxilia formed the bloody, unbreakable anvil, the Primaris Marines were deployed as the lethal, unyielding hammer. More specifically, vanguard strike forces were utilized as surgical scalpels in the choking gloom of war. Warriors executing the very doctrines utilized by veterans like Titus deployed far beyond the safety of the fortress walls, dropping directly into the heart of the advancing Xenos swarms. While the mortal defenders held the line at a staggering, ruinous cost in blood, these elite transhuman phalanxes struck deep into the Xenos command structure. They hunted the monstrous synapse creatures with ruthless efficiency, severing the Xenos synaptic web and blinding the hive mind just long enough for the defensive macro batteries to shatter the disorganized horde. It was a brutal, perfect synergy of mass attrition and hyper-lethal precision. Millions bled in the irradiated dirt so that a handful of genetically enhanced demigods could sever the psychic head of the beast. Yet within this grand, cold calculus of galactic survival, the true cost of the horrific war was still measured in the quiet, blood-soaked moments between the slaughter. Beneath the macro-scale movements of entire battle fleets and the shifting lines of planetary defense, the lingering trauma of the conflict continued to haunt the minds of individual warriors. As the fires of the orbital batteries illuminated the poisoned atmosphere, the grand narrative of the Macragge directive narrowed from the ultimate fate of an empire down to the burdened soul of a single battle brother named Chiron. The unyielding defense of Ultramar required more than mere bolter and blade. It demanded absolute, flawless discipline from every son of Guilliman. For Brother Chiron, this demand was once an agonizing burden, obscured by the psychic and spiritual scar known to his chapter as the Mark of Calth. 10 millennia ago, the traitorous word-bearers brought catastrophic ruin to the Jewel of the 500 Worlds. They left behind a trauma so profound that it seeped into the very spiritual fabric and genetic legacy of the Ultramarines. This ancient betrayal manifests in certain recruits not as despair, but as an uncontrollable, blinding fury. It is an ancestral echo of a dying world, a hunger for bloody retribution against the forces of chaos that threatens to eclipse the rationality and tactical grace prized by the avenging sun. Chiron had carried this primordial hatred in his blood, letting the screaming ghosts of Calth guide his weapon in a ceaseless, bitter quest for vengeance. Yet the apocalyptic climax on the ash-choked plains of Demirium did not break him as it might have broken a lesser man. Instead, the sheer, crushing magnitude of the horrors he faced there acted as a brutal crucible. Surrounded by the unfettered madness of the warp, the roaring inferno of his ancestral wrath finally burned itself to ash. In the quiet, desolate aftermath of that slaughter, a profound clarity took root in his soul. Chiron realized that to fight solely for vengeance was to invite the very corruption he sought to destroy. Vengeance is the domain of the traitor and the beast. He is an Adeptus Astartes, a transhuman guardian forged by the Emperor to be the immovable shield of mankind. This revelation stripped away his blinding rage, replacing it with a profound and utter stillness. In the dim, incense-heavy light of the arming chambers, Chiron sits in absolute silence, performing the sacred rites of maintenance upon his battered ceramite. Every movement is deliberate and precise, perfectly adhering to the most stringent dictates of the Codex Astartes. He strips away the grime and the gore of Demirium, anointing the scarred plating with holy unguents. There is no anger left in his motions, no ghosts whispering demands for blood in his ear. The frenzied avenger has died, leaving behind only the perfect stoicism of a true space marine. His mind is no longer a tempest of roaring memories, but a cold, silent fortress of duty. He is whole, anchored entirely in his solemn vow to protect humanity from the encroaching dark. This newfound, icy serenity within Chiron serves as a quiet anchor for his entire squad, radiating a disciplined calm that paves the way for his brothers to confront their own lingering doubts. It is within this restored harmony that the heavy mantle of command begins to settle upon another, drawing a different warrior out of the shadows to face his ultimate test of brotherhood. While the searing fires of vengeance were finally banked within the disciplined heart of Chiron, the triad of the squad found its ultimate equilibrium only when its final pillar settled into place. Brother Gadriel had walked a narrow and arduous path, his mind shackled by the uncompromising chains of rigid dogma. For much of their brutal campaign, Gadriel viewed Lieutenant Titus not as a battle brother, but as a deeply dangerous variable. He had acted as a watchdog appointed by suspicion, evaluating every command through the unforgiving lens of the Codex Astartes. Yet the galaxy is a realm of infinite malice, and the dry ink of holy texts cannot predict every shadow that moves in the void. In the mud and the blood of their desperate crusade, Gadriel learned a profound lesson forged 10 millennia ago during the darkest days of the Horus Heresy. He came to understand the ancient and vital legacy of Aeonid Thiel. Thiel was the legendary Ultramarine who first recognized that when faced with unprecedented horrors, blind adherence to the theoretical leads only to absolute slaughter. It was Thiel who taught the 13th Legion that sacred doctrine must adapt to nightmarish reality, embracing the practical if the Imperium was to survive the impossible. Gadriel saw this ancient wisdom resurrected in the battered flesh of Demetrian Titus. The theoretical dictated that Titus was tainted, a disgraced pariah who should be scrutinized with an executioner's unblinking eye. The practical proved that Titus was the very soul of the Adeptus Astartes, a warrior of unyielding purity who bled for mankind when lesser men would falter. The shift in Gadriel was not a quiet internal revelation, but a magnificent public realignment of his very spirit. Before the assembled warriors of the Second Company, Gadriel consciously cast aside the heavy mantle of the skeptical overseer. He deferred to Titus openly, offering his loyalty not in subjugation, but in genuine, unshakable reverence for his commander. This public demonstration cemented a sacred bond that no mandate of the Inquisition could ever fracture. The command dynamics of the Second Company fundamentally shifted in that profound instant of unity. Gadriel embraced his true purpose, becoming not a judge of character, but the truest lieutenant and the most steadfast confidant his commander could ever ask for. This is the true beauty of the Astartes Brotherhood, shining brightly against the darkness of the 41st millennium. True loyalty is never mandated by a piece of parchment, nor is it blindly given simply because rank demands it. It is earned exclusively in the crucible of endless war, tempered by shared agony and welded together by the spilled blood of the enemies of mankind. Gadriel had transcended his rigid programming to become a wise and seasoned veteran. He became a warrior who finally understood that the Codex Astartes is a brilliant guide to victory, not an inescapable cage for a Space Marine's soul. With his former watchdogs transformed into a fiercely united vanguard, the suffocating spectre of suspicion was finally banished from their ranks. The squad now stood indivisible, a perfect and lethal weapon forged in the searing fires of mutual trust. Yet as the deafening echoes of their shared victories settled into the quiet, sanctified chambers of their strike cruiser, a much deeper silence awaited the one who had led them through the storm. With his name cleared and his brothers bound to him by unbreakable bonds of blood, Titus was left completely alone to face the dark mirror of his own long journey. The bonds of brotherhood are forged in the fires of shared suffering. When Gadriel at last bowed his head to his commander, a fractured circle was made whole once more. Yet Demetrian Titus stands apart, an island of adamantium in a sea of blood. He bears a burden that no battle brother can truly share. His journey from the forge world of Graia to the ash-choked battlefields of Demetrium is a testament to the tragic irony of the Imperium. He was punished not for failing in his duty, but for succeeding too well. Titus possesses a soul of such absolute purity that the corrupting touch of the warp shatters against it. This is a gift that the dark universe abhors. It is a resilience that breeds suspicion in the minds of lesser men. Betrayed by Leandros, a brother blinded by the rigid dogma of the Codex Astartes, Titus was cast into the shadow of the Inquisition. For over a century he vanished into the ranks of the Deathwatch. He became a Blackshield, a nameless ghost hunting the Xenos in the darkest voids of the galaxy. The spiritual scars of that exile cut far deeper than the tearing claws of the Tyranid swarms. He was a true son of Guilliman, stripped of his colours and his name, yet he never once let the flame of his loyalty die. When mortal wounds finally brought him low, the apothecaries commanded him to cross the Rubicon primaris. The brutal surgery shattered his ruined frame and remade him into an apex weapon of war. His flesh was rebuilt. His bones were laced with the strength of a new era. Yet the Rubicon primaris could not excise the ghosts that haunted his mind. The memories of his interrogation, the lingering sting of betrayal, and the faces of those he could not save remained etched upon his soul. He emerged from the surgical sarcophagus a giant, but he carried the same silent, suffocating grief. His ultimate redemption on Demirium was not a gift bestowed by Lord Marneus Calgar. It was not a decree signed by the Inquisition or a pardon granted by the chaplains. Titus earned his salvation through the sheer, uncompromising force of his own honor. Faced with the insidious whispers of chaos and the crushing weight of suspicion from his own squad, he refused to break. He refused to let bitterness poison his duty. In his stoic defiance, Demetrian Titus proved himself to be the absolute exemplar of the Adeptus Astartes. He is the shield that does not shatter, the sword that does not dull, and the soul that does not corrupt. He has reclaimed his rank, his honor, and the trust of his lineage. But in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, personal absolution offers no respite. The victory of one man is but a fleeting spark in a galaxy consumed by eternal night. Titus knows all too well that his redemption cannot stop the encroaching tide of nightmares. The Tyranid swarms still devour the stars, and the legions of the ruinous powers tear at the fabric of reality. The heavy silence in his eyes is not peace, but the grim understanding that the greatest wars are yet to be fought. To find peace within oneself is a rare and precious anomaly in this unforgiving galaxy. Yet the redemption of a single space marine, even one as resolute as Titus, is but a fleeting spark against the suffocating dark. Do not be deceived by the quiet that now settles over the ashes of Demirium. The destruction of the sorcerer Imura was a triumph of the spirit, but in the grand calculus of the cosmos, it achieved nothing more than the purchase of a few bloody seconds. The Imperium loves to sing of total victories and glorious conquests. Here there was only a desperate stay of execution. Beyond the fragile atmosphere of the reclaimed world, the true nightmare continues to unfold. Cast your mind into the cold expanse of the Segmentum Ultima and behold the true terror of Hive Fleet Leviathan. Mortal commanders often draw their battle lines upon flattened charts, picturing the galaxy as a shallow disk to be conquered from edge to core. The Great Devourer suffers no such limited geometry. The tendrils of Leviathan do not strike along the established warp routes or clash cleanly upon a two-dimensional front. They rise from the dark void beneath the galactic plane itself. Like the jaws of an abyssal Leviathan closing around the soft belly of the Milky Way, the Hive Fleet attacks from an axis of absolute shadow. Thousands of star systems across the galactic east are engulfed simultaneously in a suffocating psychic shroud. There is no flanking this enemy, for the enemy is the very floor of the cosmos, rising up to consume the stars. To look upon the strategic Auspex readings of the Eastern Fringe is to invite madness. The scale of the invasion shatters mortal comprehension. For every gargantuan bioship shattered by the macro cannons of Ultramar, a dozen more freshly birthed horrors slither from the intergalactic deep to take its place. They are utterly inexhaustible. They are constantly adapting to every weapon the Emperor's servants bring to bear. The Imperium hurls its greatest heroes, its finest armadas, and the boundless blood of its mortal regiments into the meat grinder, merely to keep the Xenos jaws from snapping shut. The Tyranid swarm does not wage war for territory, pride, or malice, it merely feeds. The war of attrition is entirely asymmetric, a mathematical certainty of doom that grinds down the strongest adamantium fortifications into raw biomatter. What the Adeptus Astartes achieved on Demirium was not a victory to end a war. It was the grim and necessary work of surviving just long enough to draw another frantic breath. They held the line against the inevitable, buying the wider Imperium a fraction of an hour on the doomsday clock. But the shadow in the warp still presses down upon the minds of all living things with a crushing, suffocating weight. The macro threat of the endless swarm remains entirely unbroken, an ocean of chitin, teeth and hunger that cares absolutely nothing for the individual sacrifice of heroes. When the adrenaline of battle finally fades and the barrels of the bolters cool, the bruised and bloodied defenders are left to look upon the absolute devastation wrought upon the worlds they fought so bitterly to save. To look upon the aftermath of this campaign is to understand the truest definition of an imperial victory. It is a triumph measured only in mountains of ash and the silent weeping of shattered populations. The inexhaustible shadow of Leviathan may have been temporarily cast back into the void, but the worlds it touched will never again know the light they once held. We claim survival, but the physical reality of the sector tells a story of annihilation. Behold Kadaku, once a verdant jewel teeming with aggressive flora and untamed life. It is now an agonizing sphere of corrosive sludge and half-digested rock. The towering canopies and feral hunting grounds have been dissolved into putrid biomass pools. The Tyranid swarm drank its very soul, stripping its atmosphere and bleeding its oceans dry before our fleets could intervene. It is a desecrated husk that even the hardiest pioneer would despair to look upon. Then turn your eyes to Avarax, a former testament to the industrial might of humanity that has been brought to utter ruin. Its sprawling hive cities, which once housed billions of souls and fed the vital war engines of the Imperium, are now little more than skeletal wastelands of twisted steel and choked ash. The grand manufactorums are silent, their colossal furnaces cooled and buried beneath an ocean of the dead. It will require centuries of grueling, unbroken labor merely to clear the xenological taint and the human corpses from the lower hab levels. The staggering wealth and infrastructure accumulated over millennia have been reduced to irradiated slag in a matter of weeks. Yet even that devastation pales before the unspeakable horror of Demetrian. It was a world that suffered the dual agonies of the Great Devourer and the creeping, malefic corruption of the Imperium. What the Xenos sought to consume, the Warp sought to twist. To deny both, the planet was subjected to the merciless, world-cracking fury of our own orbital bombardment. Demetrian is now a quarantined dead zone. Its crust is shattered, its skies permanently stained by the unnatural hues of radiation and lingering warp taint. No human foot will ever safely tread its surface again. Deep within the administratum vaults of Macragge, scribes labor by candlelight to update the great census of the 500 worlds of Ultramar. With single dispassionate strokes of their quills, thriving hive worlds and untamed jungle worlds are coldly reclassified. They are struck from the ledgers of the living and added to the ever-expanding columns of death worlds and dead worlds. This bureaucratic finality cannot possibly capture the magnitude of the tragedy. Planetary ecosystems that took aeons to evolve, and sovereign societies that required millennia to build, are erased from existence with a single drop of black ink. The human and economic cost of this survival defies mortal comprehension. Billions of loyal citizens perished screaming in the dark. Entire generations were wiped out, their ancient gene lines extinguished from the galaxy forever. The economy of the sector bleeds from 1,000 unclosable wounds, straining to support an endless war effort that demands infinitely more than it gives. The traumatized mortals who emerged from the rubble are forever broken, haunted by the chittering echoes of a nightmare that cannot be forgotten. We label this survival a victory solely because the alternative was absolute extinction. There is no celebration to be found amidst these planetary graveyards, only the grim realization that we have merely purchased another bloody dawn with the shattered bones of our own people. The ashes of Ultramar settle upon a realm forever changed by the unfathomable horrors of the void. The staggering toll of survival has been exacted in rivers of transhuman blood and the shattered minds of 1 trillion mortal souls. We have walked through the ruin left in the wake of the Great Devourer, and we have witnessed the creeping, insidious rot of the arch-enemy. Yet amidst the smouldering pyres of fallen worlds and the weeping monuments of heroes long dead, the Adeptus Astartes remain unbroken. High above the ash-choked plains, upon the colossal fortified walls of a Macragge stronghold, stands Demetrian Titus. He is clad once more in the immaculate, fully repaired cobalt-blue ceramite of the Ultramarines. Every grievous gouge and heretical scorch mark from his previous ordeals has been meticulously erased by the chapter artificers, though the invisible scars upon his soul remain untouched and unyielding. He looks outward into the abyssal black of the void, his stoic gaze piercing the indifferent veil of stars. He is not celebrating a victory, for there is no lasting victory to be found in this darkened millennium. He is simply waiting for the next deployment. He listens to the silent howling of the cosmos, waiting for the inevitable moment when the clarion call to slaughter sounds again. For this is the bitter, inescapable truth of our epoch, a truth etched into the very adamantium foundations of the Imperium of man. To be a human in such times is to be one amongst untold billions. It is to live in the cruelest and most bloody regime imaginable. Forget the power of technology and science, for so much has been forgotten, never to be relearned. Forget the hollow promises of progress and understanding, for in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. There is no peace amongst the stars. There is only an eternity of carnage and slaughter, and the echoing, mocking laughter of thirsting gods. The Immaterium bleeds into reality, unleashing horrors beyond mortal comprehension, while Xenos swarms devour the galaxy from the galactic rim to the segmentum solar. Every star is a burning pyre, and every planet is a tomb waiting to be filled. Why then do the angels of death continue to draw their blades? Why do veteran warriors like Titus stand against the encroaching tide of unending nightmares, knowing that the tide is utterly infinite? It is because they do not fight to win the war. Ultimate victory is a myth born of a forgotten golden age, a dream that burned to ash during the Horus heresy. They fight to deny the darkness a total triumph. They fight with righteous fury and roaring chainswords, simply to delay the dying of the light for one more single day. They are the final, defiant bulwark against the extinction of the human species, offering their immortal lives in the most glorious and tragic sacrifice the universe has ever known. We leave them to their eternal vigil, out there in the freezing dark. The Emperor protects.